So my name is Karen Pfeiffer. I'm the chair of the Minnesota ASU Biomedical Consortium, who's hosting this event. I'll get some housekeeping stuff out of the way and do a little intro here for Steve, and then we'll get going, 'cause I'm sure you don't want to listen to me. So within the next 2 days or so after the class, you'll get a thank you email with a bunch of links for CSA, a link to Steve's or QRX's YouTube page where they're going to post the recording. Hopefully it works. You'll get your certificate of attendance, etc. So that will all be
and a copy of the slides.
Oh yeah, and a copy of the slides. There's a bunch of links in there too, so hopefully they'll be helpful. The restroom, if you go out this door or this door and then just go around to the back is where the restroom is. Coffee and water, of course. We're going to break about noon.
Yep.
So that you can get something to eat. Did I forget anything? I don't think so. So today's topic is obviously CSA. And I've been implementing and executing CSA since 2013, and I've been a software tester for over 25 years. And I cannot wait to see what I'm going to learn today. And so that's what I hope you take away from education too. And this is why the biomedical does what we do. It's all about education, because your experience, right? Well, the next time, if Steve were to present this again, I don't know, 6 months from now, a year, whatever, word for word, everything, I guarantee you'll have an aha moment. So don't make it a one-time deal. Keep going to CSA, keep going to whatever it is, the classes that you're going to. Because I know I'm going to learn something from Steve, and I always do. Because so I always change a procedure thanks to you, etc. So, okay.
I'm nothing if not disruptive to the industry.
Yeah, right. I'll get off my soapbox.
Yep.
Steve, you have the room.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome everybody. We'll see a good crowd here. Say about half the room and online is from Ferring Pharmaceutical. Appreciate that level of support. We actually have a number of groups, so that was kind of cool to see. So let's make sure this is all working. On the right screen. There we go. All right. So a little bit about myself. I have actually been in the med tech industry now 35 years this year. And that was after 7 years in the computer industry. So I do have a love for all things software. So, and I've done software as a medical device, software in a medical device, and software not related to a medical device at all. That was where my career started. I've been a actual software developer, and then I moved into med tech and quality, doing quality systems development. I have a background in project management. When I was doing software development outside the industry, and actually when I came into the industry, it was around engineering automation, so CAD tools, PDM tools. I know we have a few people from PTC. I know them very well. I'm a certified auditor, but everything for me always comes back to software. That was my original home and what I continue to love. I alluded to that I work here at St. Cloud State University. I'm an senior adjunct instructor. This is one of my classrooms, and I teach in there. If you're not familiar with it, we have a master's degree program, 3 master's degree programs focused on the med tech industry, 1 in quality, 1 in regulatory, and 1 in clinical. And I teach in the quality one, and somewhat crossover into the regulatory students as well. By training, I'm supposed to be a mechanical engineer, something I never did in my career. I came out of college, got into the computer industry, developing software for electrical design. I don't know how I got the job, but that started me down the path. And our paths always go in weird directions. And I'm way over certified. So my contact info is up here. If you think of anything afterwards, I'm always happy to take questions by email. Connect with me on LinkedIn. Follow my company on LinkedIn. These days, I'm a consultant. My company is QRX Partners. We're a small consultancy based here in the Twin Cities with the global clientele. As the Q and the R would imply, we do quality and regulatory consulting in the med tech space. So that's about me. You'll see I like to build in some humor. I try to make quality interesting. And as I alluded to, I might say some heretical things here as we go. I tend to not see any sacred cows, which is really what I want to do today. Is right. That's why it's referred to as more of a pragmatic approach to this. Right, you can read the guidance, you can read the standards and the regulations, and they're pretty black and white. Problem is, they're not black and white, right? Especially when you're in the device field. Not to insult my pharma attendees here, pharma is actually really easy. The regulations are prescriptive, and a lot of times companies that are moving from pure pharma into, say, a combination product. Right? Well, we're going to put that drug in an injector now. Now you have a combination device. And we run into this a lot where those companies go, oh, well, we've been in regulatory for years. It's just another regulation. It's easy. And then they take a look at the device regulations and go, this doesn't actually tell you how to do anything. It just gives you some guardrails. Where's the instructions? Right? And that's the problem with the device industry. And the guidance documents tend to be the same way. They give you all these possibilities. How do you make that real and apply that? And so that's what we're going to focus on today. So online, looks like we got over 40 people online. Go ahead into the chat area and just start to say hi and where you're from and what you do. In the room, let's see, how many of you are from Ferring? Okay, almost everybody. And I didn't get where you're from.
Francis Medical.
Okay, Francis Medical. And I can't remember the name of your company.
Agripure.
Agripure. And Walt, where are you these days?
I was 21 years in Medtronic with Steve, and now I'm with a software company out of Charleston called IndySoft. They do calibration asset management.
We're implementing IndySoft right now.
Awesome. I'm here to help any way I can.
There you go. Wow, what a big connection. So yeah, we've got too many people to go around the room and do all the individual instructions. But yeah, I can see people are finding the chat area. So that's great. As we go through this, I don't want to just be me talking at you. I prefer if you have a question, there's Q&A built in all the way at the end and some places in between. I prefer if you have a question, you ask it at the moment we're on the topic. So in the room, raise your hand. Online, just open your mic and say, Steve, I have a question, and we'll talk about it right there. I encourage questions. I get it. For some of you, this may be new, and there's always that fear of asking a stupid question. The whole point of being here is to learn. Everybody's learning. If you have a question, I'm going to guarantee you half the room has the same exact question. So don't be shy. Let's answer those things. And I'm never mean to my audience. I'm mean to companies and the regulators. You know, so, but I'm not mean to my attendees. All right, so what we're going to do today? Well, we're kind of doing the introductory stuff here. We'll get through that pretty quickly. I always like to start out with the basics, right? So we'll do an overview. How did we get here? What does it mean? Right, what are some of the general concepts involved? Then we'll start to dive a little deeper into, so what is the framework that's being created by the guidance? Right, what does each element of that actually mean? We'll break for lunch. Where's lunch coming from today, Karen?
Hy-Vee.
Hy-Vee, okay.
Sandwiches.
Sandwiches, okay, sounds good. Online, of course, you're on your own. And then when we come back from lunch, we're gonna do an exercise. We're gonna do an assessment of some software, different types of software. So we'll break into groups. Online, you'll go into breakout rooms, and hopefully we'll have a little fun and see how you do with applying some of the information that I presented in the first half. And then we'll come back from that, discuss, the results of that exercise, and then we'll talk about some more specific real-world applications in some very targeted areas, and then we will wrap it up, hopefully on time. All right. So I will warn you, this is the first time this is being presented. I hope I got the timing right. So that's always the challenge when you develop a new presentation is, do you have the timing down? So hopefully I practiced. So we'll see where we go. All right. So with that said, let's dive in. So a lot of you did provide questions in advance. That's great. So I could see them and tried to make sure I built that content in. There were some really good questions, things like AI. The second one that came up about, can you validate a portion of the software as part of a system? And the answer is going to be yes. We'll talk about that. People want to know what's the difference between what was out there and what's there. And I'm going to stop on this one. I can't answer this one because we're talking about non-product software today, not about actual software as a medical device. That's a completely different set of requirements. Unless the person who asked that question was asking about tools to support development of software as a medical device. In that case, yes, we are going to talk about that, right? Because it's both direct implications and the supporting tools that fall under the new guidance. So, but anyway, it was great that some of you, shared in advance. It helps me construct the materials accordingly, and the questions were pretty well spread out there. So I appreciate those of you who put some advance warning as to what you were concerned with, or sharing what you're struggling with there. So, but it's pretty common. It's what we see when we're talking with clients about how to apply this. So you're not alone in all of this. All right, so let's go into the basics here. So how did we get here? I've heard of people are refer to, everybody seems to be familiar with CSV, right, which is computer systems validation based on the original guidance document, the general principles of software validation, right, or GPSV was the longer acronym, right? So we moved from an FLA to a TLA. I'll let you figure out that acronym. So, all right. That guidance was actually focused mostly on the software as a medical device or software in a medical device, right? So the stuff that was going to go out the door. 29 pages of the guidance were focused on that. And then there was one section at the end about automated systems and quality system software, and they devoted an entire 4 pages to that. Okay. So it was sort of an add-on without a lot of thought to it. The focus at that time was that you determine the amount of validation based on the process risk. And then how the software would be used within that process. There's a little bit of a shift in that thinking, but that was kind of the original. Well, what is it? Where is the software being used? And that drives the risk factors. We'll see, as we go through this, that it actually sort of flipped around to how are you using the software, and then how does the process weigh into that? So they kind of flipped it around. And it kind of implied lots and lots and lots of documentation, regardless of what you determine for risk level. There wasn't a lot of help in understanding how do I scale this to what I'm doing. It was mentioned that there was sort of a risk-based approach, but they didn't really explain it very well. And the result of that was either companies over-validated because they just applied a one-size-fits-all approach. All software that I use in my company, out of fear of the FDA inspectors, I'm going to make sure I validate it to the nth degree, or the opposite, we're not going to touch it. We're just going to put software in, we're going to beg for forgiveness later, because it's just too much of a burden to figure this all out. Right? I got bigger fish to fry. So, not a good situation. And like I said, that wasn't really the intent of that guidance document anyway. Moving forward, we jump forward to 2025, and FDA says we get it. And you're all complaining that you don't know what you're supposed to do, or that this is way too burdensome. And FDA goes, that wasn't really our intent, right? It may not seem this way. FDA is often trying to not be burdensome to you. I get it. It doesn't feel that way at all. But they talk about that a lot. It is really a driver. How do we make this effective, but not overly burdensome? Right? They use what's called the least burdensome approach. You actually have the right to complain to their ombudsman if you feel like they're not doing that. You can push back and say, I don't believe you're following your own policy around least burdensome approach. Right? And they will listen to that. So that came out in 2025, 41 pages completely devoted to non-product software. Right? So the entire guidance only focuses on non-product software. They did update that in February because the new version of 820 came out, the QMSR. So they updated it to align with that. And they also added some more clarifications there. I've heard people already throw around the acronym CSA. Go through the guidance, and that acronym does not appear. Okay. To FDA, CSA means the Canadian Standards Association. That's why they don't use that. Don't worry about it. Call it CSA. Everybody knows what you're talking about, because not many people are thinking about the Canadian Standards Association, right? Other than the regulators themselves. And I will use CSA throughout. If my business partner, Mark Swanson, were here, he sits on a lot of the ISO groups, and Amy, and he right away keeps stopping me. You can't say CSA. You can't say CSA. It's wrong. That's why he writes the standards. And then I come in and I interpret. So again, right, they made it more clear about this idea of a risk-based approach to let you scale your validation. That was what they always wanted you to do. It just wasn't very clear in the old regulation or the old guidance document. And of course, they updated it to recognize the current state of technology. So now it does acknowledge, we understand software is usually delivered in the cloud, and you can do infrastructure as a service, software as a service, platforms as a service. And they go, that's all fine, right? There's no restrictions on that. We recognize those are out there, and we want you to make sure that those things work as well. It does not replace the old guidance, though. So those 4 pages are still relevant. Think of the new guidance as clarifying what was in those 4 pages and expanding on it. And so they want to make sure that did not go away. So the basic concepts in those 4 pages in the original guidance are still okay, are still applicable. Right? But ultimately, what this is about is that you establish and maintain confidence that your software is fit for its intended use. And I bolded intended use because I'm going to keep coming back to that phrase over and over again. Okay? Hopefully that's a familiar term. It's not the same as the intended use of your device, but the concepts are the same. What are you doing with this? Right? What is its purpose? What is not its purpose? Those kind of things, right? And that drives all of your decisions. So when we compare the two, okay, it's moved towards, again, understanding process risk and how you're using the software. Before, it was sort of implied that the software type is what drove things. Well, that sounds like a risky type of software, so therefore you have to over-validate it. And now they're saying, well, it might be a complex software, but you're using it for a very non-complex function. That's what you focus on. Therefore, it does not require a lot of validation. Excel. We will talk about spreadsheets today. Right? Excel. I can create incredibly complex formulas in Excel. But if I choose to use Excel just because I want to log books being checked in and out of my office, you're using a very complex tool to do a very non-complex operation. Low risk, no validation required. And despite the fact that the tool is capable of doing things much more complex and dangerous. So they want you to think again about intended use. This phrase will come up a lot as well. 29 times in the guidance, reasonably foreseeable failure. Previously, the implication was that you had to understand the probability of something occurring. Was it likely to fail? Then that increased the risk. Now they're sort of saying, we don't care about probability. If it's reasonably foreseeable, meaning a non-zero probability, you should be addressing that. So they've sort of lowered the bar in this case, right? But that's an important concept to them. That's part of the thinking. What could go wrong? How have I addressed that in my software? Because if I can imagine that it could go wrong, then it could go wrong. Doesn't matter that it might be a 1 in a million occurrence. It can happen, right? So they want a very conservative approach to that. If it has an impact on patient safety, which is ultimately where this all goes, right? They've made it clear there are all kinds of different testing that can be valid. So they acknowledge you might be able to get away with unscripted testing, what we would call exploratory testing, which is where, here, user, play with this. See if you can break it, right? No script, just do what you would normally do with this and see what happens. You could just rely on, we're going to just monitor how the software works. You could build in automated checks, and then we'll talk about when the supplier provides you with a validation of what you're buying from them. Right? But FDA is acknowledging all of those could potentially be okay. Once you decide what does the software do, how are you going to use it, and what are the risks associated with that.
Question on slide. How do you square that first line where we're talking about portion of risk to the risk with GAMP and GAMP classification software?
I'll talk about that in a second, but GAMP is not a big factor in guidance. It's referenced once, but I'll talk about it in a few more slides. We'll get to some of the other things that this connects to. All right. As I said, right, they're acknowledging, right, the current state of technology, right? The software tends to operate in the cloud and is delivered in a variety of ways. You are allowed to take credit, basically, for the supporting tools and other controls that you apply to your software environment. And that can help you reduce the risk profile. And I'll talk about what some of those possibilities are, the types of controls. but they're allowing for understanding that your software operates in an environment. And you've built certain safeguards in there, and you get to take credit for that in deciding, does that make my software less risky because I've built controls around it, or I've used other tools to support it, develop it, test it, right? That all counts. However, keeping in mind that if you're going to use supporting tools, those might also be subject to validation. And if you're going to use a tool to validate your software, how do you know the tool you're using is valid to do that? Right? But likely that software will be at a lower risk than the software you're validating. This one's interesting. If you are putting a device on the market through the PMA pathway, of course, our pre-market approval pathway, class 3 devices, they have made it clear that changes to software that you use for production and quality systems could necessitate submitting a supplemental PMA. The same way you have to evaluate things like a significant change in manufacturing. That software change, since it runs manufacturing maybe, could also be considered significant enough to have just changed your PMA. Therefore, you have to resubmit. And that's important for those of you who are in class 3 devices. It also applies to humanitarian device exceptions.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
What's the thought from a biologic or a pharmaceutical versus the device?
So ostensibly, this is device oriented, this guidance. However, when you look at the concepts, you go, I would think FDA would appreciate you doing these things in any of the things that they're responsible for, whether it's drugs, biologics, veterinary medicines, feed, right? It's sort of like part 11. It's like, that's not just specific to device, it covers everything under FDA. They haven't said that in this guidance, but you look at it, you go, oh, these are not unique to device. So I think it's best practice, and you could apply it more broadly and probably make, FDA happier as a result. Not that that's our goal. Right? I teach that a lot too. One of my heretical sayings is, remember, the auditor doesn't work here. Right? Stop including them in your decisions. How many of you sat in a meeting and someone says, yeah, but what will they say in an audit? Should never enter the discussion. What is best for the patient? That's the discussion. That's the same thing the auditor wants. Anyway, that's a whole nother session that I do. But I do like to point out, right? Those inspectors show up maybe once a year. Why do they get a seat at the table when you're making business decisions? Anyway, so, and that comes into play here as well, right? This is about doing the right thing for the patient. And ultimately, that's what the auditors will want to see. And now the quality of your documentation is what's important, not the amount of the documentation. You get to scale that. And if you've rationalized the degree of validation required, the type of documentation, it could be very minimal, and that will be just fine. So it's no longer this, oh, I have to have, a dozen and a half documents to prove that I validated this software. They're saying if that's not appropriate for the intended use of that software, then you don't need to do it. Least burdensome approach. All right, so here I'll talk about some of the other touch points for this guidance. Obviously, it's predicated on 13485. Okay, within ISO 13485, we have 4 areas where it reminds you that you have to validate the software you're using, whether that's to run your QMS, to run production, handle servicing, or monitoring and measurement software. And so 4 times in the standard it says, don't forget to validate software you're using for these purposes. This is the answer to how. Okay, I have to, that's, by reference, the 820 regulation now references 1345, essentially making 1345 mandatory, right? So any of the requirements in there now become essentially regulations. So you must validate those 4 uses of software. The guidance document helps you figure out, all right, how do I have to do that in order to be compliant with the standard, which is what the regulation is telling me I have to follow. I mentioned 21 CFR Part 11, right? If you're not familiar with Part 11, that's the regulation on electronic records and signatures. It was established, what was that, like 2000 something? No, another regulation that's often overinterpreted. It is mentioned 16 times in this guidance because they understand the point of having software is to be able to create digital records, right? And then that usually brings with it then digital signatures as well. So they constantly remind you, make sure you're addressing requirements in part 11 as part of consideration for the intended use of your software and therefore what needs to be validated. I'm not doing a deep dive on part 11 today. If there's interest, we could develop that and do another session. Because I have a lot of opinions on part 11. I was there when it came out and I watched all the frantic activities that occurred and the misinterpretations, and we still get it wrong today. So, there is a technical report from ISO, supported by IEC and AMI, I think Yancey as well, 82002-2, which is again about validation of software for medical device quality systems. And I do often see people when they're writing articles or other, people that are doing workshops on CSA always mention 82002. The catch is FDA does not reference that in the guidance, and FDA does not recognize that as one of its consensus standards. So if anybody tells you you have to apply that standard, that would be incorrect. However, it's a decent standard. It has some good stuff in it, so it's good reference material. And if you're looking for ideas for how do I do this, it's a good resource. Okay? But I wouldn't tell FDA, oh, we're good. We followed 82002-2, and they're going to go, we don't care. Okay. Tell us about how you, applied what's in the guidance document. By the way, I want to apologize. I have this cough going on. I am going to try to keep drinking and pop cough drops here, but I apologize if I start to gag on my words. And then somebody asked about GAMP. If you're not familiar with GAMP, that's the Good Automated Manufacturing Practices. What do you want to call that? It's really a guidance, but it's sort of treated like a de facto standard for what it says for automating your manufacturing environments, and particularly around the software that drives that automation. The guidance document does reference it in a footnote, basically acknowledging that it's a good resource. That if you're looking for more ideas for how the methods you could use in validating software in the automated environment, FDA is saying GAMP is a good place to look. So it's interesting that they mentioned GAMP, but not 82002. The fact that they took a footnote, not a big deal, but you always have to understand how FDA thinking works. If they actually say it somewhere, it's important. They don't mention it, it's not important. So beyond that, I think you asked the question about GAMP. Oh, you did. Sorry. Yeah. They don't go any deeper than that, other than to say, yep, we're aware of GAMP. We don't have any problems with GAMP. Feel free to apply. All right. All right. So I sort of alluded to this, right? That I don't really spend a lot of time worrying about inspectors and auditors and the FDA itself, except where I absolutely have to. The point of doing this is not to make FDA happy. Again, the auditors don't work here. Okay? You have all kinds of business reasons to follow this guidance. Okay? Your company probably spends a lot on IT, or it feels like it does. Your manager probably, whatever you spend, manager feels like it's too much. Okay? Don't you think they want to know that what they've bought for that actually works? Makes business sense. If I'm going to spend money on something, a tool, a piece of equipment, whatever, I expect that it works and provides me business value. That's what this guidance does, is ensures that the software works, does what it's intended to do. So forget about a regulated environment. Any company would want to know that its IT investment has been worth it. Show me that the software I just helped, let you buy does what it's supposed to do. It helps you optimize resources, right? When we're going to put a piece of software in and we have to figure out how to support it, how to validate it, test it, do updates to it. If we have this one size fits all, suddenly it becomes very burdensome, right? And we're over assigning resources to something that maybe that could be scaled down or not done at all. Right? So applying the guidance helps you figure out how many resources do I really need to maintain my IT environment, and especially where it becomes relevant to the regulations. So obviously, again, that's a business value. And again, sort of back to the first bullet, I want my software to work because software that doesn't work can be incredibly disruptive. Anybody ever read articles about companies that almost went out of business when they tried to implement SAP? There's too many of those articles, okay? Right, where they basically let a piece of software take over their operations and they didn't validate it well and it doesn't work. Suddenly they can't ship a product, which is bad for a business, right? You don't ship, you can't charge, right? You don't charge, you don't have any money coming in, you can't pay anybody. So again, applying the ideas in this guidance should increase the reliability, right? So you know these systems are going to do what you need them to do and are not going to screw up your operations. Right? None of that is a concern of the FDA. It's all a concern of the business. And that's ultimately what should drive your decisions. How do I run a business that produces a safe and effective product? All right. So in terms of demonstrating conformance, first, 2 words. I'm usually really big. I don't know if any of you follow me on LinkedIn and my posts. I often talk about terminology and why it is important to get the words right, particularly in a regulated environment. So conformance versus compliance. Right? And I did see some of the questions I got asked ahead of time. People like, yeah, how do I make sure I'm compliant with this guidance? Okay, compliance implies requirements, mandatory. I must do this. Conformance implies that I'm doing something voluntarily. Okay, so there's a big difference there. Okay? Remember, this CSA is guidance. It's not a regulation. Okay? So you're not required to comply. It's a good idea to conform, but that's your choice. Okay. Now, I will acknowledge that sometimes it often seems like FDA does not understand what the word guidance means. Once they publish guidance, they kind of expect you to do it, right? They sort of imply compliance, even though it's a guidance document. Right? But you're not required to, technically. You could do something else. Okay, I think I've got that up here. Right, so they expect you to conform. They may treat it like compliance, but you're allowed to do something else as long as you can explain it and why that's as good or better than what they suggested you do. You always have that ability. Then the argument would be, well, why would you when they've laid it out? We wanted this with standards like ISO 14971, the medical device risk management standard. Again, not mandatory. Okay? FDA recognizes it. All of their questions will be related to 14971, but you're not required to follow it. Why would you not? They've written an entire standard explaining what to do. So why would you not use that? Okay? Unless there's some reason it does not apply to you well, which would be really odd. Okay? So anyway, again, it's up to each company to decide what is it that's going to work for them and then be prepared to defend it. Okay? And that's whether it's FDA or your notification body, BSI, DECRA, whatever. Yeah, did I hear a question?
Yeah, no, there's a question, how would one defend themselves? Can you give an example?
So that comes down to, and I think this is coming up on the next slide when I talk about how do you demonstrate conformance. Right? So I just did a post this morning about a warning letter, and I said, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. Everybody know that phrase in this industry? That's really what it comes down to. Show me the documentation then on what you did and why you did it that way. Rationale is big. Not just what, why. Give me your reasoning. Tell me how that applies to what you're doing and why you needed to do it that way. Most auditors and inspectors will get that. And sometimes that's the test. They can say, all right, you documented what? Can you tell me the reason for that? If you can't defend that, that's when they're going to go after you. But if you've got a good solid story, well, we did this assessment of the process and the risks, and we decided this, and this is how our business operates. We made these decisions. Got it. You've defended it. Right? Because FDA is not there to tell you how to run your business. You get to decide how to run your business. They just give you the minimum requirements you have to do since you want to be in this regulated industry. Now tell us how you did that. And how that works, right? Then you need to prove, okay, and that also prove that it works. Hopefully that answered the question that was online. All right, so continuing on this theme of defending conformance. So, right, if it is a document that happened, having SOPs. We've written the procedure down or the process down. What I would suggest is that you have a procedure on non-product software validation. Right, take the ideas and the guidance and turn it into, this is how we're going to make that work in our environment. There should be forms, right? So you can capture records of how did you do assessments of the software? How did you make decisions about risk? Where is that documented? Templates, right? If you know that some of these systems are going to need a full validation, which means we're going to need to document the requirements, right? The intended use. We're going to have to document the test protocols, the scripts, and the results, right? They'll come up in records, right? But this is the case where you are going to produce the documentation. One, that the SOPs is about, we fully understand how to do this work. Okay. These procedures should be integrated with other procedures. Anybody familiar with the concept of a process approach? Okay. When you read standards like ISO 1345, don't forget to read section 0. All right, how many of you realize there was a section 0? Okay, yeah, usually I don't get a lot of hands. I don't know about online, there is a section 0 which establishes the basic concepts in the standard. By the way, if you're applying 9001, same thing. Okay. You can't, everybody jumps to clause 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 in 1345. Because that's where you get more specific things. The problem is, those are all based on the concepts introduced in section 0 or clause 0. So if you don't understand clause 0, you can't understand 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. You might think you do, but, and that in section 0 or clause 0 contains things like a process approach and a risk-based approach. It explains those two concepts. So with the process approach, it implies you're not creating a bunch of standalone procedures. They are to be connected. So yes, you should have a procedure for how to handle non-product software validation, which should be integrated with things like an IT management process. How many of you have that? You don't have to raise your hand. All right, well, that's good, at least one hand. But more often than not, companies don't do that because, well, what does that got to do with the FDA record? A lot. Okay. Your quality system is how you run your business. IT is a big part of that business. So you should be saying, how do I manage my IT environment? And then how does that translate into other areas of the QMS? So there should be connections. I'll show an example here of how these might connect. And purchasing, you have to buy software. When somebody wants to buy software, do they understand the rules for how to pick those vendors, how to validate, what's going to be required to validate that software, how to engage IT? Oh, look, we got all 3 procedures now connected, right? That's the thinking that's required here. So again, the purchasing SOP establishes the requirements for assessing those software purchases for validation needs. And in the IT, SOP should establish requirements for how do you do validation, when do you do revalidation, right? And what's required before software gets deployed in the enterprise. And when I say enterprise, it doesn't mean only for big companies. Okay, 5-person companies are an enterprise and have an IT environment. Even though small companies should be thinking about, how do I manage that?
Quick question. So for software development, that kind of feeds into, so like custom software, we're developing custom software. Should that be like a separate SOP that feeds into?
Yeah, so the requirements of software as or software in a medical device, very different, right? Much more burdensome as it should be. There might be a connection. I mean, it should be its own thing. I have seen people just do software validation and it covers everything. Now they're very different, okay? So I usually recommend that they be 2 separate procedures. However, your product software development procedures should, since you're probably going to use some tools to support that, right? You're going to use code management tools and code writing tools and bug tracking. Those are all tools that are non-product software to support that process, right? So there should be a connection. So I probably should have added that one as well.
And then another question with the template, maybe we'll go into this later, but as far as like intended uses, you know, you'll want to capture that, right? And wondering like for custom piece of things, like specific requirements for how the software should function, you know, if it's more custom, like should that be like a separate template there? Does it make sense to kind of spin it off to a separate one or kind of?
There's a lot of different ways to decide how am I going to capture the intended use. Could be a separate form, could be part of another form where you're doing these. I'll show some examples. But you could just capture it there in a section, go describe what function, the features, and what you're going to use them for. Now do an assessment of those things using these questions. Or it could be, you know, maybe your IT policy is if you're going to buy a piece of software, you have to fill out this form explaining exactly what you intend to do with it. Now we have that documented, and that can be referenced. As long as you capture it somewhere. Right? You shouldn't be buying software going, oh yeah, I need some statistical analysis software. Buy me some licenses of Minitab. What are you going to do with it? Purchasing probably would think, sure, I can go get you Minitab, right? We have an agreement there, right? And it's like, no. There's more questions to be asked. How do you know that Minitab is going to do what you need it to do? Where are you documenting that requirement?
So if it is more custom, like, so you have the intended use that you capture with it, right? Then if you have like specific steps for like how you want it to function there, that should be, we're trying to decide, I guess, like what makes sense as far as like.
Yeah, and again, it's scalable, right? If you're, you know, you could just say, we're just buying Minitab because we need a general statistical analysis package, right? Okay. That, we don't have any specific uses for it other than engineers like to use Minitab. Okay, great. Or you could say, well, we're going to buy that, but we also have some cases where we're going to specifically do this type of analysis in this part of the operations to understand this. That's important to capture, that besides the basic capabilities, we dive deeper here, which might, the risk associated with just a general statistical analysis package, pretty low. It's a supporting software with no clear direct impacts on patient safety. But your other use might be more specific, maybe make more connection to the patient. Right? We're going to use this to decide on the optimal process parameters in manufacturing, which determines whether or not the device will actually function. That's different, right? It's the higher risk. So questions back.
Yeah, I'm just trying to apply it to like, because we do have a combination product, but there's no software tied to it. And I know that this training is device related, which I have some familiarity with device. Can you help me understand when you're saying product versus non-product? Like, how are you defining what a product software is? Is that part of like the device itself?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
and non-product would be anything that like.
Anything that never goes to the customer or the patient.
So everything.
I mean, specifically this guidance, they say it is for software that is used in production and to run your quality management system. Those are the barriers. Okay. If it is software in your medical device, firmware, different process. If the device is software as a medical device, different process. Same as SIMD, right? But those are product software, either as a component or as the device itself, product itself. I am using the word product because I understand we've got some pharma people in the room, right? And this would apply to services as well within the regulated space. But the guidance is clearly towards the device. But again, it's pretty transferable between other types of products. Just wanted to see, I think something popped up in here. All right, so there's a question, if our company has a CSA master plan, does that cover IT management SOPs if we include about the validation, revalidation? Or is it recommended to have a standalone IT management SOP? Up to you. I just suggest that you have a standalone SOP. Having a master plan can serve the same purpose. You've documented the rules and the intent and how to do things. That's fine too. Okay. Call it an SOP, call it a work instruction, call it a QSP, call it Bob. Okay. As long as you capture this information and disseminate it, right, it's all okay. Okay, good questions, right? But again, that process approach is supposed to play in here, right? It's not a standalone activity. It is supposed to be connected to other things going on in your quality management system. All right, continuing on this theme. So then there's the records. Again, keeping with that vision document, it didn't happen. Right? The SOPs, the forms, the templates are sort of the how do I do this? Now, where's my evidence? Right? That's what records do, is they provide proof that you follow those things. I suggest you have the software inventory. Where's that master list of everything the company uses? Okay, and not just the obvious stuff. Outlook, right? Right? Word, Office, CAD tools, Minitab, SAP, those are the obvious ones, but are you actually on top of things that maybe some engineers snuck in on their desktop? Right? How about when we talk about spreadsheets? I'm not talking about when somebody creates a work log, but when they actually produce a spreadsheet that helps them make decisions within the regulated requirements. IT should be aware of that, or the company should be aware that we are using this tool, right? So creating an inventory that says, what do we have? If there's a version, what version are we up to date on it? It's important. And what was our decision around validation? And when is it due for revalidation, or does our procedure or our master plan indicate what are the conditions for revalidations, right? And has that occurred with this, right? You want this log that says we have an understanding of our environment. Because you don't want to get caught, and again, I don't try to focus too much on the inspectors, but when FDA walks in the door and they go, oh, how did you make that decision? And the engineer says, oh, well, I have this great spreadsheet, right? Or I bought this piece of software off the net. It was freeware and I downloaded it. It does this great job of helping me make these decisions. And then they go, oh, great. Tell us about the validation you performed on that. The what? Right? You get those kind of situations. You don't want to get caught in that. Right? And then the inspector says, oh, I'd like to speak to your head of IT. Were you aware that this gentleman, this person, has downloaded this piece of software and is using it to make decisions from a regulatory perspective? Why not? Why aren't you on top of that? Isn't that your job? We call this the please dig here flag. Right? So it's a way to end up in places you don't want to end up in. So yeah, do an inventory. What do we got out there? Okay. And then for each item in the inventory, there should be an up-to-date assessment documented. Okay. Where did we document the intended use? And then what did we decide about the level of validation? And then where are the records of having done that validation, whatever it is we identified? Proof. Right? So back to the other question about how do I demonstrate it? Like in anything else in your quality system, I have it proceduralized. I have records to show that I follow that procedure and that it works. Let's see, something else popped up here. Oh, long question. Holy cow, very long question. All right, so my company has an overreaching validation procedure that addresses all potential validation work in our company. Software falls into multiple categories. Software that is used in production inspection cannot be altered by our personnel. Software that's used in production inspection of product and can be altered by our personnel. Software used in the implementation of devices, quality system, software used in a medical device. This covers initial validation of software and then addressing changes, updates. The entire procedure is lengthy, but TUV and the FDA have been satisfied with it, and our implementation since we wrote it. I think it helps that I learned validation of pharmaceuticals and have brought those practices to med device. Yeah, so I don't know that there was an actual question in there, but it was nice sharing that. Back to that question of how do you document this? There isn't one way. Okay? They've done it through a master plan and it covers a lot of different areas. It sounds like it's incredibly robust and answers all the questions. So they don't get tripped up. When somebody says, why did you do that? Oh, because we've covered that in our master plan. And here's our proof that we did that. Right?
Is there like a date where you have to do a revalidation? So like if your computer program is from 2014 and you're still using that same version from 2014, do you have to do a revalidation if it hasn't changed?
There's a lot in that, but the easy answer, or the basic answer is no, software does not expire.
They don't say like every 10 years.
Well, when you
or
say
every
didn't
year.
change, it's not just the software, we never updated the software, but so when I was at Medtronic and we were doing, I was the head of the project for Y2K. Some of you look too young for that, but we had a computer down in production that had a big sign in it that said, "Do not power off." That might have been, you might have been around for those. It was a very old, I don't even know what version of Windows, it might not have been Windows. It might have been pre-Windows, and they were running something that was important to the operations. And the company was out of business and therefore could not be updated. They were never to update the operating system, never update the drivers, do not touch this thing, right? If that's the case, that continued to operate that way 20 years,
Yeah.
right? Just fine. But if it's somewhere on the network and the network gets updated or the operating system gets updated, the drivers get updated, you can't say the software is the same or it will operate the same over time.
Do companies that provide software that is supposed to be Part 11 compliant, are they required to notify you whenever they push out automatic updates?
Hold that thought, we're gonna talk about that
Okay.
later, because that is a problem that needs to be considered later. So no, time-based is probably not, so you wanna have what types of changes should trigger validation, right? A major shift in the operating system from Windows 10 to Windows 11 might be a good trigger. We should do some sort of basic revalidation of our systems, make sure they still operate the same way. Major change in drivers. You need, again, you need to think about the environment, right? And then what are we gonna do when the software itself updates? What if we've decided not to implement any updates from the vendor, but the vendor has said, well, your warranty is only good for 18 months. If you don't update, then we no longer support you. Is that a risk? I don't know. Is there?
Well, I just said the periodic review. Usually I read a section and it says if you've updated it, change control in the last 6 months or your, whatever the company's wants, then your periodic review is done. Otherwise you should be doing something to go.
And it's another thing, creating an inventory can become a tool. When did we install this? When was the last time anybody looked at it? Right? Wow, 15 years, that piece of software has been there and it's not at the same version. Maybe we should go talk to whoever's managing or using that piece of software and go find out what's going on there. But again, if you don't have that inventory, you're unaware, right, of what could be out there. Other than you walk past something and there's a sign that says do not power off.
There are some comments there for you.
Oh, okay. Scroll back a little bit here. Okay, that was the big one. If we have, okay, one says if we have a release done weekly or twice a week, how do we ensure conformance? Let's hold that till after lunch. We're going to talk about commercial off-the-shelf software and the problems related to that, which is what I think that's an address to. Currently working on a risk-based assessment for updates pertaining to off-the-shelf software like Minitab, Business Central. What are your thoughts on that? So we'll hold that to the afternoon portion. Somebody made a comment regarding periodic review. If you're conforming to the EU requirements for GXP computerized software, see the EU GMP Annex 11. So Annex 11 is the EU's equivalent of Part 11 in the US. They're very similar. But you should have both if you have to comply with both, right? Because there will be subtle differences in there. And apparently, yeah, and that does cover periodic review. If background patch updates to any software which doesn't change the intended use or any functionality, does it need revalidation? Let's talk about that this afternoon. That is one of the challenges is, do you have control of those updates when you buy a commercial off-the-shelf cloud-based system? So, all right. You're thinking in the right way here. All right, so we talked about demonstrating conformance. So I talked about, right, the process approach. So this isn't like the way it has to be. This is just one way to think about it. How do you connect up different processes in your quality system? Right? Now, sad to say, too often I don't find these type of pictures in people's quality systems. I get a list of SOPs and no indication of how they connect. Right? You should somewhere have this, right? For each process area, how are you connecting up those things? A list of SOPs, that's old school functional thinking. It does not imply a process. Having flow diagrams implies that you've thought about the process. But this is where you think about it. How do these things connect up? Look, I brought in doc control. Because if it isn't documented, it didn't happen, right? We probably have that, show that that's connected to these processes, right? Prove things. So just an example. This is not an overly complex flowchart. Now, it's only one piece of the quality system, right? It's particularly around IT management, but one, it's a way to help your IT organization understand how they fit into your quality system. Because a lot of times I do find that IT goes, oh, we're not part of that. Yes, you are. Okay, because we need you to support these aspects of what we do in the qualities and in operations. But anyway, you should be thinking about these, capture this kind of information somewhere. And then you dive down into, so this is diving into this SOP. I'm a big fan of flowcharts. Right? Then you open up that SOP and it goes, overall, this is what the process looks like. Now you can go read about all the details. People love pictures when you're trying to train them. This is what they'll go to first every time if you provide it. I'm here. Now I know where I'm going next. I know what decisions are being made. I know what records are required. But just an overview of how this might look, right? I have to understand the intended use. What are the requirements? How do I capture that? Some sort of record. I do an assessment for the risks, and I'll show you an example of what this could look like, right? To generate that, to finish up that record. We will talk about spreadsheets later, right? And that's a different animal in a lot of ways. So maybe we have a separate work instruction on that. We have to figure out, right, what the requirements are. We perform those validation activities. We get validation records. We did it. And now the software is valid to use, right? And we update our inventory list accordingly. And then we look at our triggers for revalidation. I love a good simple flow chart. Makes it really clear. What are we trying to do? Have we really thought out the connections? Yeah.
Good question about that, like software requirements and then going into the assess risk and validation requirements. In the couple of slides, we were talking about, how that should fit in really with like acquiring that, like a lot of this should be happening before you acquire it to make sure the software is actually right. So like, should that software requirements gathering really be happening, prior to purchasing?
I would say yes, right? Part of educating your organization is to get them thinking. Right? Not that I've already made up my mind, I want Minitab, right? It's step back. What am I trying to do without any brand names? Well, I need to do this type of analysis, this type of analysis, this type of analysis for these reasons. Capture that. Now go out and go, which tool is the one we should purchase? Right? Now consider other things related to how we're going to have to validate which one is capable. Because that's a thought we'll talk about later. That sometimes some tools are easily validatable and others don't provide you with a lot of stuff to work with. Right? So you all of a sudden got to go, should I be buying that tool if I'm not going to be able to manage it? Right? According to these guidelines. So yes, I would say yes, that should be thought of ahead.
Yeah.
Before you submit the purchase request.
These types of process models can't necessarily exist in a bubble because as a company, it requires
Some of
multiple
the comments
different
in everything is this idea of understanding requirements before you do anything else. Right? Whether that's designing your device, designing a manufacturing process, figuring out how the packaging is going to work. Right? What's my sterilization going to work? Am I going to sterilize? How do I pick my software? It all comes back to requirements first. But we love to solve a problem and jump ahead. Right? And somebody says, what's the requirement? The requirement's that I buy Minitab. That's not a requirement, that's a solution. Right? It comes back to, if you look at the standard, right? They have design inputs and outputs. You don't jump to the outputs without doing the inputs. What you're asking about are the inputs. Yes, you should do the design inputs first. That's the requirements. What am I trying to do with the software? Now, What are the possible options? Great question. All right, so again, I love a good flow chart. Men typically like visuals, right? They say we're more wired for that, for visual learning. So, but I think even, if you take populations as a whole, regardless of gender, I think it's over 60% tend to be visual learners. Right? So I hate SOPs that are just a tome, right? War and Peace, right? Lots and lots of words. That's not how people learn. It's not how they retain information. See a picture, and that sticks with them. So big fan of that. Yes.
I would just add that I feel like it's really helpful when you go through and you make a spreadsheet like this or a workflow like this, because if you can't make it, then clearly the process doesn't work. So
The reason I'm so big at this is my software development background. That I found I could write software faster and better if I flowcharted it first. And I had a teacher who explained that. And when I got into college, and we did some programming there, even as a mechanical engineer, and out into industry, I was faster and my first yield was better because I had already done this. And to your point, if I couldn't make a nice clean picture, all the lines were crossing and jumping over each other, I was right? It was too complex a solution, which meant there were more opportunities for failure. Right? If I could get it to nothing, I mean, when I use Visio, I'm like militant about it. I don't want any lines to cross. Can I do this without crossing the lines? That's my challenge to myself, right? So, just my quick aside. So when I was in college studying mechanical engineering, we had this one course on programming, a language called Fortran 4. Oh, do you know that one? All right, not many people know that one. There's a commercial on TV now where two people are watching a robot punch holes in a car hood. And somebody says, how do we fix this? And the woman goes, oh, we need a COBOL. And I like laughed out loud because I didn't even know anybody knew that. Fortran and COBOL are old languages, all programs. Anyway, so we had to do Fortran 4. All right, and this is going to tell you how old I am. Okay. This didn't exist. We created what were called punch cards. Which was a card about that big, and you sat at a typewriter and it punched holes in the card. And then you took this, every card was a line of code. And you took your box of cards and you handed that to somebody behind a window in the computing room, because you weren't allowed to go near the computers. And they fed the cards in, and then you waited and they handed you a printout. That was how computing worked when I did this. So we had to create a program as part of this course. And I watched as everybody punched in their cards. And first of all, forget about typos. That was your first big problem, is did I type it in correctly? And then watch them get a single sheet of paper back after their cards have been run, saying syntax error. And that was it, meaning their program did not run correctly. It either failed on logic or they typed something wrong. And I brought my box of cards. It wasn't a big program, so it was probably about 130 cards, something like that. And I handed that in, right? Waited my turn. 10 minutes later, my output came out and it was complete. And everybody around me leaned over and went, how many tries did that take you? And I said, that was one. You know what? How did you do that in one? Because before I walked down to the computer center, I sat in my room and I drew one of these. And now I knew exactly how my code needed to progress. So yes, I'm a big fan of get the requirements right first. Flow it out, and that's a great test of whether your logic is right. All right, sorry. I love telling stories. And as I said, we'll talk about spreadsheet validation later. All right, pretty close, 4 minutes over. So before I move on and talk about the framework, any other questions related to the general concepts here? You guys are off to a good start. Just make sure there's something new here. Just the one. It's a patch. All right. Does the FDA guidance and applicable standards provide guidance on how requirements should be decomposed? For example, user needs to system functional requirements, if I talk about traceability, or is the decomposition strategy primarily an engineering best practice rather than a regulatory expectation? A little bit off topic, but it is a regulatory expectation. FDA expects you to do traceability, as this person just described, from user needs to user requirements to system requirements the specifications, the test requirements, the test protocols, the test results, right? You are supposed to be able to link all this stuff up. How? No, they don't tell you how. Okay, you figure out what's the best way. Am I gonna do that on an Excel spreadsheet? Am I gonna do it on a number of Word documents and I'm gonna code things to be able to match them up? Am I gonna buy a piece of software that does requirements management? All of those are valid, as long as you can show that they work for what you're doing. But again, it's rare for FDA to tell you how to do it, unless you're in pharma, in which case they do. In device, it's pretty rare. All right. Any other questions? Or move on to the next section? All right. All right, so within this framework, the first piece of it is understand your intended use. Okay, as I said before, this isn't the same as your product's intended use, but it's same concept. Do you understand what you're trying to do? Because as we just discussed, those are the requirements that establish the basis for every other decision you need to make. Don't understand that, you can't possibly make the right decisions. So what exactly are you trying to do with the software? What functions are you using? What functions are you not using? That could be important to distinguish, because maybe the software you're bringing in does a lot of things, but you're not using all of it. So you want to clarify, we are not going to be using that functionality, therefore it's not part of our risk considerations. Only using these modules, these functions, and here's what we're going to use them for. Unless we're saying we're just going to use them, we're bringing in an EQMS with a document control module, we're just doing basic doc control. Fine, that's enough of an intended use. Okay? However, if you wanted to say things like, oh, well, we're going to use that module and then we're going to look for trending in terminology and content consistency. Okay, now you're into new territory, right? You'd want to clarify that's different than just, I want to do revision control and capture signatures, right? That's a different approach. The base question, is this software to be used as part of production with the QMS? Earlier with the question of, where does this extend to, right? It is just simply, is it part of production or is it part of your QMS processes? Anything else is outside the scope of the guidance. It can be either direct or supported. Direct meaning things like I'm going to automate a process. Right? So the software is going to run the process. Or supporting, I'm going to use this software to develop other things, maybe other software. Okay. I'm going to use it for general record keeping, but those records are required by regulation. Right? Or I'm using it to establish local infrastructure. Right? I've got a network of robots, which is a separate network from the rest of our network. Right? Or clinical data where we have to protect, right, private health information. That kind of thing, personal health information. Things that are excluded, right? General business management. So your email systems, your accounting systems, sales, Microsoft Office, all of that is outside the scope of this. Yeah, we used to. So I talked about all the craziness that happened when Part 11 came out, and everyone, oh my gosh, we have to prove that Microsoft Word is Part 11 compliant. No, you don't. We have to prove that our CAD software is part of. No, you don't. Okay, and things that are general infrastructure, so your general network, security, your backup systems, they're not part of this. If you localize, like I said, if you have a network of robots, that's what you're automating and controlling with a different network, then you might have to validate that network specifically.
How do you decipher between like, so say you're like releasing a record that's like a Word document, right, versus like a CAD file?
You mean is the CAD system?
Is the CAD system? Yeah, yeah.
So I used to get that a lot too, like, oh, well, the CAD system is going to be valid. I get that Word doesn't need to be validated, but our CAD system. No, Word, Excel, CAD, PowerPoint. Those are just tools to create records. Okay. If I'm doing finite element analysis, that's different because I'm going to make decisions on that. But your CAD system is a glorified word processor that does pictures. Right? FDA is not concerned about whether or not you can create a good picture.
So that falls in like the general business.
Yeah, that would be
Yeah.
under general business, yeah. And actually, the guidance actually specifically refers to CAD systems and says, no, they're not what we're talking about. Yeah, well,
So when the CSA document was in draft, they had direct terminology, they also had indirect terminology. Did the indirect terminology go over to the final release?
no, they chose the word supporting. Yeah, I was looking at it again, when I was putting this together, and I went, yeah, direct would imply there should be an indirect.
Yeah. Wasn't it
And I
direct?
didn't keep a copy of the 2025 version, to see if it was in there.
Okay,
But in the current version, they use the word supporting instead of indirect. But when you read everything about supporting, they're talking about indirect usage. Right? That's the concept there. Just get a quick check here. Let's see. Would data analytics generated from a tool be considered direct or supported? So my students love when I give this answer. It depends. Okay. What are you going to do with that data analysis? What's its purpose? Okay. If you're doing it because you want to understand cycle times in operations in order to reduce costs, no. If you're doing it to determine whether there are failure trends that will determine whether or not the product gets released for distribution, then yes. Okay. So back to intended use. It's not the type of tool. Data analytics in itself may or may not. Tell me what you're going to do with it. And now I'll be able to tell you, does it fit within the scope or not? Then the next question is traceability matrix required mapping the requirements with test cases. Oh, that's a whole nother topic about traceability. So the general answer is yes, but I'm not going to do a deep dive on that. That's a whole nother area in terms of traceability in your quality system. All right, keep going there. Okay, so intended use, I think, is a fairly straightforward concept. Do you really understand what you're going to do with the software? Or you're just going to use it the basic way it's supposed to be used? That's an important distinction. Right? Just need to capture that, and now you can do an assessment. All right, a risk-based approach, right, is part of this framework. If you've read the standard 1345, right, you see these words, should be proportionate to the risks, right? That's the concept here. Keep those words in your head, proportionate to the risk. So the validation is to be proportionate to the risks. And then we'll talk about later about finding those risks. Your methods are up to you. FDA is not going to tell you, here's how you figure that out. Okay. They have specifically said they're not really expecting you to do a formal risk analysis. So you don't have to do an FMEA if that's the tool you like to use, or any other fault tree analysis. They're not saying you have to be formal. You just have to consider. Risk-based approach is the informal version of risk management. Okay? Risk management is 14971. When you're going to do specific analyses and evaluation and controls and residual risk assessment, right? That's all part of product development. Risk-based approach is, have you thought about the risks? How you do that could be, we had a discussion and we kept minutes. There's our risk assessment. Right? We approach the risk, we understand it now, and from that we can make decisions. That's sufficient. You need to consider process and device risks. Okay, and device risk refers to patient or user harm. Right? In this industry, at the end of the day, everything, right, is about the patient and the user. That ties back to it all. So when you're going, well, what are the process risks? Right? The question is, well, can a failure in the process somehow manifest itself as harm to the patient, to the user? Okay. If you're going, oh, we're going to end up with a lot of scrap. Okay, that's bad for business, has nothing to do with the patient and the user. Okay? Unless you're worried about that bad product getting scrapped after it got out and then comes back. That's a different scenario. So something popped up in the chat. All right, let's see. Somebody said, I mentioned FEA software. Does this require validation if used as an off-the-shelf product? We'll talk about off-the-shelf a little later. Again, the answer is it depends. Right? how are you gonna use that FEA and for what purposes? Generally, yeah, probably, I do understand FEA. I used to be an expert in that area. So I'd say yes, it probably does require some degree of validation. All right, now we got, what evidence do you recommend in validation documentation, if any? Well, it's not if any, unless you justify not having to do validation. E.g. is noting that the test step has passed, yes or no, and that this has been confirmed by whom and when sufficient, or do we need screenshot evidence? Oh, that question. Okay. I run this a lot when we're doing software validations. Well, if we're going to give the script to somebody, do we require them to take a screenshot of every step that they take? It depends, unfortunately. Generally, no. Okay. There has to be some degree of trust. You're explaining to somebody how to execute a test script, right? It should be specific. Click here, record the result. Or did you see this result? Yes or no? That can be totally sufficient. Okay. If the outcomes are not that crystal clear, then you might say, we want you to capture a screen capture of what you got. If it's not like yes or no kind of clarity. So you have to think about, what is it I'm trying to understand, and that'll determine how detailed does my proof have to be. But generally, if you've got a script that's very clear and you say this is the expected outcome, either confirm or say I didn't get that, that's usually detailed enough. Somebody popped in, what about software like HR tools, use the document trainings? A lot of software in the organization is always QMS related. Hold that thought, we'll keep talking about that. That actually might pop up in the exercise. But I don't want to go too deep in that. All right. This idea of you have to consider the reasonably foreseeable failures. I talked about that earlier. That likelihood is no longer relevant. Right? So if it's a non-zero probability, they want you to be addressing it. Now that may seem not like the least burdensome approach, right? Because generally in risk management, right, you get to do severity and probability of occurrence. Probability of occurrence is negligible. You get to discard that. And they're basically saying, yeah, no, if you've decided that this software has, well, this is part of determining, does it have the possibility of affecting the patient or the user? Then you need to think about, well, what are the possible failures and how do they relate to that? Right? And if it could cause harm, and it's not a non-zero, if not a zero probability, then yes, you have to address it in some way. I get it, that makes the assessments sometimes get pretty broad. But they want you at least demonstrate, we've thought about those possibilities. Okay. So I thought this was interesting. And I actually had to read the guidance again to make sure that I wasn't missing something. It's kind of like the direct versus indirect. As I started to read through, I realized they talk about high risks and not high risk. There's no other grades. There's no low, medium, high, or anything in between. There's no 5-level scales like we would typically do with 14971. It's either it is high risk or it isn't high risk. And they do talk about that in the guidance. And they say, yeah, if you want to create a scale, have at it. But FDA is not requiring you to. They mainly want to know, have you identified what's high risk? You can treat everything else separately, but the high risk is what they're concerned. So your grading system is not of concern to them. If you want to go binary, high, not high, that's all good. Okay. It seems odd. I was surprised, I was like, oh yeah, I forgot that was there. But it's definitely clear in how they word everything. And like I said, then they do actually address it. I can't remember what section it's in, but it's in there. It might be in the risk-based approach section. And basically, right, then they say, all right, so high risk, what does that mean? Failure to perform as intended may result in a quality problem that foreseeably compromises safety, just what I was just talking about. Okay? So high risk is anything that could end up back at the patient or the user in terms of harm. Okay? So when you're trying to figure out, again, what they say, the translation, right? If you're trying to determine if the process risk is high, it's does that lead to the possibility of harming the patient's needs? Process risk is not high just because you don't get one. As a business, high risk, right? It's not a regulatory high risk. All right, then they talk about choosing appropriate assurance activities. Appropriate means risk-based. Same theme throughout all of this. Okay? So you're allowed to scale it. I think this was one of the questions somebody asked as part of your registration about, do I have to validate the entire system or can I just do components of it? Yes, you get to pick. If the entire system would be considered high risk, yes, you're going to have to validate the entire system. But if you're using a system with a lot of different modules, and some of the modules are not related to production or the QMS, or not high risk, but some are, you only have to do the ones that are. Let's go. So you do get to adjust. Not just, oh, this piece of software does 12 different things and only one of them is high risk. I guess we have to validate the entire software. No. Okay. You get to say we only have to validate the portion that is high risk based on how we're going to use it. But again, that would imply you've thought about the intended use. Again, they allow for all different types of testing scenarios, right? So once you understand the risk and the scope, then you can figure out what is testing going to look like. And that it goes from none, I can rationalize, I do not need to test this, right? Up to full step-by-step scripted testing, okay? They allow for unscripted scenarios, ad hoc. I was stunned they used the word ad hoc, or the term ad hoc. I used to always teach, do not ever use that term in front of anybody related to FDA. And here they put it into their own guidance document. They actually refer to it as ad hoc testing. So they can learn, they can adjust their thinking. And that's that. All we need to know is it basically functions. So we're going to hand it to a user and go, play with this. Tell me if you can do work, right? It's just simple. At the end of the day, did the user feel like the software is useful? Yes or no? That can be a legitimate test, is what they're saying. If you rationalize that that's all that's needed, okay? They do allow for, think about other things you might need to test, like cybersecurity, human factors, okay? Again, if you understand the intended use, you may think about there are other very specific things we'll need to understand. And then, of course, all of this can be hybrid. So you could have a multifunction software, and one part of it needs no testing, another part of it just needs ad hoc testing, and another part of it needs scripted testing. If you understand the intended use, you'll be able to map that out and make it appropriate so that you use your resources optimally. And they allow for, again, I talked about, right, you can establish controls. So if you looked at it and you understood the intended use, and from that you understood the risks, and you go, well, rather than testing that, what if we just control that? We put the right controls in place. Now we just got to test the controls to make sure they actually do work. But that can help reduce the risk profile, right? So maybe there's just active monitoring of the system. Somebody in IT is responsible for doing a weekly review of the results or something like that. You get some sort of report. Maybe it's an AI tool. And yes, we're going to talk about AI ML a little later. Audit trails to be part of that, right? The system, you buy a system, and this was one of the things that was in part 11, right? About whether or not you needed to buy systems that could produce an audit trail. So you could look back and go, who did what when, and what happened there. It could be things like, oh, well, we want it to work a certain way. It turns out we can control the workflow. Then it isn't possible to do things in the wrong order. Now we don't have to test for that because there is no other way to do it except in this order, right? If that's important, you would say, yeah, we can lock that down. You can have built-in data integrity checks, kind of like in Excel. I don't know how many of you big Excel users use the data validation feature. So if a cell is required to get an integer, You can't enter a decimal point. It will not let you. You can build that in. Software can do the same thing, going, yeah, this field has to be a number. It can't be text. It can't be a number outside the range of 0 to 100. So if somebody types 101, it beeps at you, right? Those are the type of controls you can build in. Now I don't need the test for that because I built it in. And then we'll talk about this particularly in the area of AI, human in the loop. That ultimately none of this gets to an endpoint without a person assessing it. All of those are valid types of controls that could offset the need to do extensive testing. But it's all based on, did I understand the intended use, which then helps me understand the risks.
Steve, you have some comments.
Oh, thank you. Let's see what we got here. Where did I leave off? All right, so it looks like the first one, difference between reasonably foreseeable and likelihood. How do I want to describe that? Because it's a concept in general risk management. We use the term reasonably foreseeable misuse. Like I said, it tends to be very broad because it's like, what can you think of? Use your imagination. Okay. So we have a field, we expect somebody to enter a number between 0 and 100. Is it possible somebody can mistakenly enter 9A? Their finger slipped. What happens when they hit enter? Does it take it and try to do something with it? Or does it flag it and go, that's not a valid entry? If they enter a number outside the limits and the system doesn't check for that, what happens to the outputs? Right? That's a reasonably foreseeable failure. Is it going to happen? We hope not, but it could, right? The likelihood is just for anything, right? Okay, what's the probability? How often is that likely to occur? 1 in every 10 uses, 1 in every 1,000 uses. Okay, but FDA is saying anything greater than 0 is reasonably foreseeable. Hopefully that answered the question, Jason. Let's see. Yeah, I get it. They're both probability statements. It's just a matter of you can't establish a level which you'd say, well, that's negligible. It's more than 0, but it's negligible, so I don't have to pay attention to it. They've sort of said here, if it's non-zero, you have to pay attention to it. Let's see, how to define boundaries. For example, software created by research to populate a database, which might be used by separate production software. Back to flowcharts. Okay, don't just, same as I say, don't treat SOPs as standalone, don't treat your software as standalone. How does it connect? Where will its outputs go? Hey, everybody familiar with SIPOC from Six Sigma? Suppliers, inputs, procedure, outputs, customers. You should understand the flow of information. Okay? Where does that go? Does it go to another system? Could it go to another system? A reasonably foreseeable failure, right? So yeah, you have to understand the system. Okay? So it's not just process approach, it's systems approach. Okay? You have to see where everything fits in. Let's see, did I understand you correctly that only high-risk software require validation? No, you did not understand me correctly. High risk would imply the highest level of validation. Non-high risk may or may not require validation. That's where things like unscripted testing or ad hoc testing might be sufficient. If you identify something as high risk, you're doing some level of scripted testing, most likely. You might be able to find some shades of gray in there and get away with some other approaches, but no, it's not a on or off kind of thing. They do care about non-high risk software and making sure that does what it's supposed to do. All right, so reasonably foreseeable is stipulated to mean possible. Yeah, that is how it currently reads. All right, what is high level versus low level validation? So again, high level is things like, right, prescriptive scripted testing. Low level is things like the ad hoc that I described. Give it to a user. Does this do what you need it to do? Right? No set expectations, just your opinion. Could you use this software to do your work? That's very low validation, but it is a form of validation. All right. Yes, I did say that FDA does not require us to create a grading of risk. High risk or no risk, but then translate that to, then what are we going to do? Okay. But they want you to first identify, is it high risk? If it's high risk, then our rule is scripted testing only. If it's not high risk, then we have other parameters to consider to determine, is it a lightly scripted test? Is it an ad hoc test? Is it no test? So there is a differentiation between those two boundaries. All right, like I said, in the device world, isn't it great? We get nothing that tells us specifically what to do, right? You need to look at your scenarios, your situations, and decide what is it that we need to do, and then defend it. All right, establishing appropriate records, kind of touched on that a little bit, right? Documented intended use. We talked about this earlier. Some way to capture that. Okay? Then capture your risk assessment, whatever method you're going to use for that, based on the intended use. Then how did you assess that relative to risk? I'll show you an example how that could work. If you require test plans and test cases or scripts, then obviously that needs to be documented, including predetermining what the expected result is, right? When you do scripted testing, it's not just telling the person what to do. You want to ask them, and did you get this result? Or tell me what result you got, which could get us back to, I need you to do a screen capture. Kind of, right? This, again, these concepts exist throughout the quality system. I did a post on this, I don't know, a week or two ago about, I have a video series every Friday called The Quality Heretic. If you're ever looking for just a quick 5 minutes, sometimes fun, sometimes annoying. It's just me sometimes ranting, sometimes it's just, hey, did you understand this? But I did do one talking about when do you determine the required results when you're doing design of a product. It's part of the design outputs. You don't determine it when you write the test plan. You determine it when you create the specifications. How will this be tested? What is success? The same thing applies here. If you're going to create a test script for your software, what does good look like should be part of that. Not just do this and then tell me what you got, and then we'll decide if that was okay. That's not how it works. You wouldn't accept that if you were testing your device or your drug, right? You'd want to know what is the endpoint ahead of time. Clinical trials, same concept. They have to define what's the expected endpoint they're trying to reach. They don't get the data and go, hi, do we like that or not like it? That's not how it works. And the same thing applies here. Then you have to capture those test results. The guidance does tell you, like any other test record, who did it, when did they do it, exactly what did they do. Right? And did somebody review that and approve it, kind of thing. Right? It's no different than any other record like that. Which all of these imply, right, your normal document and record controls. You have to have control of these things because they are required. All right. Change is always inevitable, right? Though, we kind of talked about this earlier when somebody asked about revalidation, can it be time-based? No, but you should know what are those triggers, right? So whatever procedures or master plans you come up with, need to establish, so what are those triggers? Is it every time the version updates? Is it, how about patches? Patches are very common. Somebody said later about like, several times a week. Well, that could be patches, right? How often do you log in the morning and Windows wants you to do an update, right? Configuration changes, right? You set up the software one way and now you're changing some of the setup parameters. Which ones would require you to revalidate versus which ones can you just do without revalidation? Do you change the intended use? We're now going to use it in a way that was different than before. We're going to take advantage of a feature or a module, a function that we weren't using before. Should that trigger a validation of that portion of the system? Does it have an impact on any other part of the system? Therefore, that needs to be revalidated. And do you change the process within which the software is being used? Because that could have an impact on the intended use of the software. These are the things, the scenarios you need to build into your procedure and say, if this occurs, then you're required to do a reassessment or do not pass go, you must do this type of testing or something like that. So, yeah, this includes, we're gonna capture that. Okay, all right, we've got a trigger event. Where do we capture the assessment of that event? And whether or not it required revalidation and how did we decide what type of validation? Explain yourself, right, is always what's required there. Understanding that the revalidation could be different than the method used for initial validation. Again, you need to understand, all right, we made a configuration change. No, we don't need to run the entire script again. We do need some of the super users to give it a try. See if they can break it. Right, just ad hoc, we're good to go. And I talked about this earlier, just understand if you have devices that are authorized under a PMA or an HDE, you need to consider whether or not your software changes will require you to issue a supplemental submission. Because they could be considered a significant change that could affect the performance and the safety of the device. Yeah, well,
Would that statement mainly apply to just the high risk category software?
good question. They don't say that specifically. I think it's, you've got to build into your whatever process you've got in place for evaluating impacts on your submissions. I think would include looking at all of it, right? Where this software has, it's not no risk, so it's not outside the scope. It may be a low risk, you'd still want to go, did we consider if that's what's changing, the low risk software is changing? Again, what's the nature of the change? Maybe because it's always possible that the nature of the software change moves it from no risk or low risk to high risk. Right?
Okay.
Or even though it's low risk, I mean, there's so many different characterizations, but they want you to at least show you thought about it, right? Is there some way this could manifest itself as harm? Right? Or something that fits the criteria for when you need to resubmit. Right? And your organization should have a good understanding, there's guidance documents on that. And you should have a procedure that says, when we do these type of changes, which now includes software changes, we do an assessment, a regulatory assessment, and decide, do we need to resubmit or not? So, done. Yeah.
I have just another question, either within that guidance document or anything you're going through, everyone defines low, medium, and high risk in different categorization. Is there something that you're presenting today on how you should think about whether it's high risk or low risk or?
So ultimately, you need to define what those categories mean. I will show you an example of how to do an assessment that gives you sort of an implicit determination of 3 levels without actually defining. I'm going to show you a decision tree and it will lead to certain conclusions. That's one way to do it. Because it can be hard. Go, what does medium risk mean? How would I define that? Right? You can argue over the wording all the time. If you break it down to, well, what are the criteria that would lead me there, which is the example I'm going to show you.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right. And then, all right, so, perfect timing. Actually, we're going to go right into that here in a second. So applicability, right? So again, how do I know whether any of this applies to me, right? Is validation required, right? Is always the first thing. And so the first is that base, right? Question 0. Is this software used for managing production or the QMS, direct or supporting? The answer is no, this is my accounting system. You're clear. Ignore all the other questions. You get the pass go. Okay. Does it manage or produce records that are required by regulation or standard? If yes, keep going. If no, you're clear. Am I using electronic signatures or electronic records? Do not pass go. Okay, now you're in the Part 11 territory. Am I using this as the basis for decisions? And I should probably add some more words there, other than basic business decisions, right? Regulatory oriented decisions. Do I accept this incoming material? Do I release the product to the market? Okay. Do I release it to the next step of the manufacturing process? Those are my decisions where you go, yeah, that has a regulatory impact and potential impact on the patient. Therefore, yes, they would be in scope. Okay. And am I automating something? They don't say it specifically, but it's pretty clear. The FDA guidance is saying, look, if you're going to automate a process, you're automatically in scope. Right? If it's a production or QMS process. Right? That's sort of a clear indicator you want to go deeper with this. All right, so again, I like visuals. I love to do decision trees. This is an example of one I've used at clients to do an initial assessment of whether or not validation is required. Okay? So some of the things, right? I've seen this before. Companies go, "Oh yeah, well, we first asked, does it impact quality?" And I go, "What does that mean?" And they go, "Well, does it impact quality? You know, the quality." And it's like, well, how about you define that, right? And so, I did this for a client. I said, how about we break it down like this, right? So that people now know how to answer this question, right, consistently. All right. If it's a yes, boom, we're in the scope of having to validate. Right? Another kind of do not pass go question. If no, we're not done yet, right? Does it produce or manage records required by regulation or standard? If yes, validate. If no, more questions. Does the software utilize electronic signatures? Yes. Yeah, yep, we're going to validation. No. Next question. Is this going to be used to make quality or operational decisions? Okay. Yes or no? Right? If no, are we going to use this to automate? Right? So it's the same stuff I just presented on the previous slide, now in question format. But showing you how the thought process would go. And then you go, yes, it is going to automate something. And I like this one. Is the software included with equipment being implemented? Because if you're putting in equipment, you probably have, right, an equipment validation plan that includes the equipment qualification, which by regulation and standard requires you to consider the software involved. So they're not saying you need to do a separate validation. It can be part of that validation effort. Okay. Otherwise, validation is optional. And notice it didn't say don't do a validation, because it's optional. You always have the, right, if you go, well, we still want to do enough testing to show that we spent the money well, right? So you still might do a very light validation, but it's optional. At least you're not required. Otherwise, all these things, you go, yep, we are definitely in the realm of having to do validation, but we don't know yet how much. That would be determined by risk. All right. So how do we determine that? Right? Right, figuring that out is risk-based. You need to figure out what method you're going to use to identify risk. And I will show you another decision tree example as a way that I like to do it. But again, back to what's your criteria for high, medium, low. I've got a 5-point scale. I've got an 8-point scale. Whatever you choose, but you choose. And figure out how am I going to define that, make sure that it works. Right? Number of levels, up to you. You want to just do high and not high? FDA said that's going to be acceptable to them. Okay. But if you want a 10-point scale, which I think is a little overdoing it, tough to be consistent when you have too many choices. Just food for thought. I don't know what your risk management procedures look like, but I've seen that. I literally saw a severity scale that was 20 levels. And I went, I would not want to be sitting in on those discussions. Is it a 16 or a 17? I don't want to have that discussion. There's a reason why most companies use a 5-point scale. You can pretty quickly drive to a consensus. Okay. All right. So but you get to decide, you get to defend why that works for you. Okay. And then, all right, we have this scale. What are the requirements at each level in the scale? I don't know how many times I see this, whether it's in supplier qualification, complaint investigations, and there's a determination and it just says, is this high, medium, or low? With no criteria, and somebody checks a box, and then there's nothing after that. Okay, why did we do that determination? If I said it's medium, so what does that drive? People miss that connection, right? So yes, you have to have a criteria for how to determine the risk level, and then what does that require afterwards? What's the difference between low and high? So just another version of something I've used that says, all right, based on the previous decision tree, we know we have to do validation, so now let's ask more questions to understand the risk levels. And in this case, this client, I based it on the type of software, right? If it's software of unknown provenance, I don't know if everybody's familiar with the term soup or provenance, not provenance, provenance, right? This is the stuff you pick up on the web that sort of created by a group, and there's no owner and there's no documentation. It definitely sounds as problematic as it sounds. FDA is a little freaky about that, but they haven't said you can't use that, but there are obviously tighter requirements. But that, if you're using any soup, that's automatically high risk. Okay? Commercial off the shelf versus a spreadsheet. So I separated out for this client, it's a spreadsheet, different set of questions to ask. We'll come back to that. All right, so let's say we're doing commercial off the shelf, and then it's a matter of what type of implementation am I doing? Am I going to use it right out of the box? Probably low risk. I'm not doing anything special with it other than what they designed it. Okay? Do I get choices on how to configure? Maybe I can set up workflows. Okay, it might be a more moderate risk. Or do I have the ability to customize? And I change it after I buy it. Right? Now we're back into high risk. Right? So without having to specifically define high risk, I gave us characteristics to consider that drive you to one way or the other. With the spreadsheet, we'll come back to this a little later. For me, one of the big differentiators in the spreadsheet is, do you have any VBA code embedded? Macros, custom code. VBA is what visual basic. Where you're actually writing software in the Excel file. That's what that amounts to. Right? Obviously, that changes the risk level. If you're not creating custom code or macros, I find that whether or not it's going to be used by one person or multiple people makes a big difference in risks. And I'll talk about this a little later. And then, all right, it's single user, but is that single user using it to make quality or operational decisions? That also changes the risk level. Your questions may be different, but it's a way to think about how do I break it down and not having to figure out how do I define high versus medium. It's more just what is the criteria we're going to run into, the scenarios we might run into. So, but I found this one works pretty well. I've used this actually in a number of clients who have no understanding of this stuff, and they kind of go, how do I figure this out? I go, just answer all these questions, and you get an answer.
Customized configure, can you give an example? That's usually a tough debate sometimes. And
So, all right, let's use an EQMS, a doc control. It does a routing for signatures. And you can configure it to be sequential or parallel. Right? Do all the reviews and approvers get it at the same time, or does it go in a particular order? That's a configuration. Right? Customization is I can write some additional code through some sort of interface so that it takes that review information and feeds it to an AI tool that assesses whether everybody was consistent in their reviews. Right? Not many companies do this anymore. Early in my career, I did a lot of this, custom solutions, based on an out-of-the-box solution, and we were able to rewrite the code. Right? Most people go, wow, that's really expensive to maintain. I want a highly configurable system. So I don't see as much of that anymore.
Yeah, most of my career was customized, highly custom.
Yeah.
And you just don't see.
Nowadays, if you buy a piece of software and it says it comes with an API pack, that's where they're letting you integrate your own software or other people's software. Right? So it is there. But I find most CIOs will say no. We're not going to have the resources to maintain a custom application.
Steve, you have some comments. I would start with James at 1140.
Okay, scroll back here. All right, all right. Is this reasonable? In a digital solution, risk management people can choose level of patient impact. And if they choose low, they have to key in a reason. So when FDA asks, they have a documented reason for why they chose low impact and therefore less scripted testing. Yes, that's perfectly reasonable. whatever method you want to use to capture decisions. I would say you could even make that a pull down. They get to choose an answer rather than write one in, so that you get some consistency, and you could do trending on that, right? You can watch for misuse, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's definitely a reasonable approach. How do you recommend an organization handles assessing risk as you move from R&D to process development to clinical? Phase 1, 2, and 3, and then to commercial manufacturing. That's a really big question. It's really more of an overall risk management question. I get you're talking about maybe the systems involved. Again, you need to understand the systems environment, right? What are the different pieces of software? How do they interact? What do they each do? What do they do relative to each other? Right? And you're talking about seeing it end to end, which would be great, but it's a non-trivial exercise, right? A lot of companies don't like to do the systems thinking because it's hard. I get it, right? You have to try to bring all of this into focus and then understand all the connections, but that's actually what you're supposed to do. So I would just say, start mapping that out. Okay? I did a gig at a company once, and they were, I refer to it as eating the IT elephant. They decided to replace everything in their IT environment. They wanted to upgrade to the latest solutions, the best solutions, in a completely integrated, coordinated, great idea, huge undertaking. They literally rented out a building with 150 people in it, 150 contractors and consultants in it. And one of the things I remember is when we walked in on the wall, like that long, was a Visio flow diagram of the entire business. That took a long time to put together. But all day long, people stood there going, okay, I'm going to work on this, or I'm going to change this, so we need to update this. They understood now, if I do this, I pull the thread on the sweater, what comes with it? It was incredibly valuable, and the project worked. It was on time. I mean, it took 2 years, but it was on time. Right? Because they thought, first we say, this is what it looks like, or we want it to look like now. Every time you make a change, walk up to this wall to make sure you understand the implications. So it can be done. Let's see. Do you see people automate this decision tree with a digital solution? I haven't yet, but there's no reason you couldn't easily turn that into something digital. Somebody asked, what is SOUP again? Oh, somebody answered it. Software of unknown provenance. Right? So it's software that you don't know where it came from, essentially. Using an API to integrate an ERP and QMS is considered customized. Probably, in my world, I would say that does count as a customization. Why is SOUP high risk? IEC 62304 says SOUP can be class A, cannot contribute to hazardous situation. I gotta pull 62304 up again. A couple of months since I've been in there. My first thought is, sorry, I don't think it actually says it that way. I can't imagine that they would say that SOUP can't contribute to hazardous situation, because SOUP by its very nature is unknown. That's the U, right? That would imply a risk that you're unfamiliar, incapable of controlling. I got homework tonight. I'm going to go look at that. Mickey, if you would send me an email, I'd be glad to follow up with you on that. But I am going to do some research. Like, I'm just skeptical that that's what it says directly. All right.
I have
Yeah.
questions about COTS and like configured or out of the box. So if you're going COTS and then out of the box, we go to low risk. And really that's because you're probably leveraging your supplier assessment. You have high trust that the supplier of that software
Yeah.
is doing their due diligence with that piece of software.
Yeah.
But if it's like, you know, a company that's not well known or doesn't have a big
Yeah, so again,
interface,
I'm not
COTS
saying
could
this
be
is
like,
the all end all question,
Yeah.
right? There
Yeah.
could easily be underneath this arrow.
Yeah.
More questions.
Okay.
Right? For generally, I do this for early stage small companies. They need something in place.
Totally.
This is usually sufficient for them.
Yeah.
Right? If you were Medtronic, For ferring, I'd go, yeah, I might have some more questions I built into a decision tree like this to get more granular. I just want you to think about, this is a way to attack the problem. Right now, what makes sense in your environment? Right, because maybe this is never really a question, you'll never custom. Your CIO has said, nope, never know how. Right, I don't even need to ask that question. What else could I put in there instead? Is there some other parameter? Just trying to give you thoughts to build off of. All right. And then, okay, we get these answers, you check which box you end up with, and then back to, so what? Right? And then I add in, well, here's your requirement statement. If I'm high risk, I do it all. If I'm moderate risk, I do that group. If I'm low risk, I do that. Right? Now the company is very clear on what the requirements are based on the risk assessment. Okay. We'll talk more about some of this stuff related to spreadsheets. Soup, I'll talk about that later as well. Actually, do I have a slide on soup? I may not, but we can talk about it when we talk about commercial off the shelf because it's usually in the same vein. Talk about cots and soup, usually in the same sentence. But anyway, just that idea of saying, all right, so we've established a risk level. What does that translate to into requirements? And again, this may not fit your environment. Just an idea to think about. After you do this, tell me what comes next. Don't skip this step. Right? So yours may differ. Your wording may differ. All right. Oh, I made those 4 minutes back. No, 3 minutes ahead now. All right, what kind of questions you got there? You can see I'm a big Dilbert fan. I don't get into all the political stuff with him. I understand he made some mistakes later, but he still was pretty funny.
Question with the risk categorization. So with CSA, like looking at driving things from intended use. Our thought with our template was like defining the specific intended use with the system, and then from there classifying, is that supporting or direct use, and then from there, is it high process risk or not high process risk? Is the thought then to like kind of more bucket the intended uses earlier into like different categories, or I guess trying to understand like the risk assessment?
If you can, so you're kind of talking about, can you standardize some of the characteristics?
Yeah.
That's always good from a consistency perspective, right? So you don't end up with these wildly different, assessments of things that should be the same. So if you can, for some things, for some characteristic, say, hey, when we're looking at a piece of software and you're considering cybersecurity, we have set conditions, right? And set answers to choose from. For other things, usability, maybe that varies, right? So I always like to think about, is there anything about this that I can standardize? Because it makes it easier to use whatever the assessment tool is, right? People don't have to think as much. They can't game the system, either intentionally or unintentionally, right? And then when I want to go back and do some sort of analysis, I don't have to worry about whether they abbreviated something, spelled something differently, used a different term to mean the same thing, right? I've driven some consistency in there. So if possible, it's always good to do this kind of things. Yeah. All right, just quick before we break here, let's see what else popped into the chat. Let's see. Okay, so. All right, how do you convince a small company with extremely limited resources that developing their own custom EQMS is not a good idea? So this is my life. Because so my company, about 60% of our clientele are pre-revenue startups. And yeah, try to tell them that they should spend some of that little bit of money they have on an automated solution. And they go, we're good, we have SharePoint or Dropbox. It can be made to work, right? If there's like 2 people in the company. I always tell them, when you hit 5, and you don't have an actual office, you're gonna be begging us to put in an EQMS solution for you, because it'll get tiresome in a hurry. Like anything else, you've got to show them the benefits, the risks, the costs. Cost usually in a small company will drive everything, because their perception is, if I have to spend $50,000 to $100,000 implementing an EQMS, no, because that sounds like a lot of money. But if you show them going, well, we now have 15 people and we process 5 change requests a week that have to go through email, and people have to PDF their signatures and this and that, and you break it down into the labor costs over a year, suddenly that $50,000 to $100,000 can seem like nothing. Right? So it's like anything else. Always speak in management's language. Management's language is dollars. Turn everything into a cost or a cost avoidance, and they will understand. Can you post on LinkedIn about the outcome of your soup research? Excellent suggestion. So whoever asked the question, send me the email so I don't forget, and then I will respond to your email, but I will also do a post. I like that idea. That's a great idea for a post. Let's see, any software of unknown provenance brought into your company could pose a general risk to your internal systems. Viruses, spyware. Yes, that's what's problematic about soup, is you don't know what's in that code. Let's see. I don't know of a single software application used in the lab that isn't configurable. Yep, all software controlling equipment needs the equipment connectivity and user access configured at minimum. Most have way more. I don't disagree. Usually it's a good approach for marketing to show that the software is highly customizable. You don't have to customize it to make it work for you. We give you the options to configure it to what you need. That's very common. But just understand, you can, if you don't understand the relationships between some of the configurations, you can create problems. I believe SAP has something like over 20,000 variables you have to set. You can mess your, that's why companies sometimes stop operating when they implement SAP. Hard to capture all that and figure out how do they interrelate. Let's see, I'm just not seeing how a move from CSV to CSA is providing less work for most systems. CSA is a new layer performing a thorough analysis of all the requirements. Help me understand the real benefit to workload by adopting CSA. Again, it's going to come down to the type of systems in use. But if you think in terms of all the things that should be in an inventory that you're unaware of, that should have been assessed and possibly validated, but you just haven't, right? That's risk, inspection risk, right? Or just usability risk, right? They could operate incorrectly. So you're avoiding expenditures at the risk of disrupting the operations. But when you look at those inventories, companies that do it are often really surprised, one, how big the list is, even in a small company. But then they find a lot of these tools, once they do the risk assessment, fall outside of the validation requirement. Now they have it documented. This is why we didn't validate. I mean, you can sort of say, we knew that all along, right? That's why we never validated. Now you have documented evidence of why it didn't need to be validated. So we were correct, or we were okay all along. And then it narrows it down to, these are the things that require validation, and the smaller subset should be the things that require heavy validation, the scripted kind of stuff. My experience has been that is a much smaller subset than having the CSV approach, where we just, if we became aware of it, we validated it the same way everything got validated, meaning we're over validating. You will find cost savings there. You will find that it's less work.
You know, that's really it, Steve. It eliminates the one size fits all, right? You have a software that is a plug and play, so it's very little configuration. And people still do it today when they're testing that same way they're testing customized software. And that's what it's supposed to help with. Oh, part of it.
Just for clarification, and then we'll break for lunch here. Somebody pointed out that my last slide on the example risk-based requirements had 3 risk levels, and the CSA guidance only talks about high and not high. Do we need to translate to 3 levels? As I said, FDA is okay with just 2 levels. You're open to use as many levels as you'd like, as whatever works for your organization. Okay, so don't confuse that the CSA is saying you're not allowed to use more than 2, or that I'm telling you to use 3 when it says to use 2. It's up to you. But at a minimum, there are 2. High risk or not high risk. FDA said that's the minimum requirement. All right, I think we'll break from lunch here, for lunch here. So let's do that. Come back in 30 minutes, so 12:35. And we're gonna see how good you can do at assessing some situations. I'm gonna pause the recording. All right, let's jump back into it here.
You guys, real quick before Steve starts, for those of you online, I know a lot of you are sharing a room because it's a larger group. Make sure I put an email address in the chat. Try to look at the camera. I put an email address in the chat and send everybody in that room to that email because I want to make sure everyone's getting their certificate of attendance, all the links and etc. So don't forget to do that.
Good. All right, so time to be creative. All right. So here's what we're gonna do. The overview, and then I'll take everything off here. So I'm gonna create a bunch of breakout rooms, 12 of them. You guys will break up into actual physical groups here. 2 should be good. But everybody online, just you get to pick a room out of the 12. So just jump in there as soon as I say go. I had said ideal was 4 participants. I know some of you are online in groups and probably want to work in that group. So that's fine if you want to have a bigger team. I'm not going to dictate the rules on that. But quickly jump into a room, and then in the chat, I'm going to put a file in there that assigns a software scenario to each room. Okay. And then basically what you want to do as a team is discuss whether or not this looks like something that requires validation, what the risk level might be, and therefore what type of validation would be required. And don't forget to think about what will your rationale for that be. I'm not giving you a form to fill out, just somebody take notes within your team, decide who's your scribe, and just kind of capture it in whatever format you want. We're not gonna come back and do presentations, but when you come back, I'll ask some questions and look for somebody from each group to kind of weigh in and share things based on the questions that I ask. Once you're in the room is timed for 30 minutes, so that we have 15 minutes when we come back to kind of go over what the outcomes were. So you take all that knowledge you just picked up this morning, all that very black and white prescriptive thinking, put it to these very easy scenarios. All right, so let me create the rooms. And like I said, once you're in the room, once I see that bulk everybody's in it, I don't want to give you the list yet because I didn't want people to pick the room based on the software. So you pick a room who you want to be with. Then you'll see what I'm assigning to the room. Well, all right. So yeah, if you have people working together online, then just go into a room and that's your team. All right, so all right, all the rooms are open. So go ahead and start picking. I don't know how you guys want to divvy yourselves up. I'm going to make 2 groups. You're going to be rooms 11 and 12. So I don't know how you want to split it. Well, I make you guys room 11. You guys can be in room 12.
Cool. You want to come over and join us?
In rooms. Post a file.
Sure.
Okay.
What time you going?
Well, you should learn.
Yes. Mind if I join? Right.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, come on over.
I'm Tara.
Right.
Oh, that's- that is-
Don't worry about it.
12.
There's more.
Yeah.
Software, I think feedback and complaint analysis. It's basically a quality system. AI based.
Yeah.
Always AI based nowadays, it's
Everything's AI.
intended use review of complaint records, including classification, trending, reportable event, investigation.
Yes, UML process, so.
This classification of AI mean that it's the spy on things or unknown
Oh,
code?
but they're probably.
Good question.
Could be in that category of hybrid.
But it also seems like it's making decisions, so that
Right,
would be making high risk, yeah, support.
Yeah. QMS,
I mean,
right, QMS, but
But you know.
high risk.
I still think.
Turn on the mic. There we go. All right. So I think everybody's back. I got trapped in a room. So the rooms can ask for help. I went in to go help, and then it wouldn't let me back out. That was interesting. I never saw that before. Everybody else had the ability to get out of the room. Not me. So I was trapped in a part of the matrix that had no exits. All right. So any fights break out? No, that's good. None in the room here, so that was all right. All right. So let's hear from see what do I want to ask you? So let's hear from either rooms 1 or 7, or both of you. They had the learning management software. So what did you guys decide? Is that something that fit the scope of needing validation under the guidance?
We were in room 7 and we honestly never saw the assignment. So we're going to defer to room 1.
We also never saw the assignment, so we just discussed someone's work situation.
Okay, let's hear about that one. Let's see what you came up with that.
Okay. I have some notes, but I think the owner of the site might be best to describe.
Yeah, hi, Amber. I can take over.
Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, we discussed about my like current project. So we're building a new plant, which is a glove manufacturing plant. So our process is like fully automated, and there's a lot of softwares were involved, like supporting the production. So I just quickly discussed an example of our mixing room. So we need chemical to manufacture gloves. So for that, equipment is integrated with the PLC software, which is a Siemens DCS system. And we have an ERP where we create our POs, like work orders and everything. And we have MES. And there is another supporting softwares like warehouse management and other small softwares, but mainly these 3 softwares were always talking to each other. So we got a big inventory. So instead of like doing an individual software validation, we came up with the strategy by using CSA philosophy. So we did a system level validation. So we pick our systems like a mixing room, and we did intended use cases workflow from where we started creating work order, and then that goes to MES and for any in-process inspection and capturing the data, and that goes to SCADA system where it takes and controls our tolerances within the equipment. So we created this entire intended users workflow, and we developed the test cases of that system. And so we're still in the phase of drafting our protocols. But my like what I'm trying to say is like we're doing it as a system level where we're covering multiple softwares at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's appropriate, right? I mean, you've identified there's clearly there's dependencies, right, that are required in order to make everything work the way you need it to work. So treating the group of software as an overall system environment and then making your decisions based on that seems appropriate. It would be the same thing as taking a single piece of software that has multiple modules and then figuring out different approaches for each module. You're taking a system with different pieces of software and going, they all have requirements related to validation to make the thing work as a whole. So I think that's a really good look at it, right? Again, I said you have to see the system. And I think that's a good example of understanding it's not just about the standalone pieces of software, but the intended use requires them to work together. So that was a good choice. You guys recovered nicely on that one. All right. So I hope that's not a harbinger of things to come. I hope other rooms were able to see the assignment. I know I had one that said they didn't see it specifically, so I reposted it and then they were able to see it. All right. So rooms 1 and 7, we're supposed to get a learning management system that corporate HR is implementing to manage annual corporate training on things like workplace safety, harassment prevention, travel policy, code of conduct, and IT policies. And the system is also going to be capable of capturing employees' external training and certifications. So what's everybody's first blush at that? Let's use that as an overall. And that includes those of you online. What are the thoughts there? Does that sound like something in scope?
Training is maintained there, then that's a.
Not all training.
What type of training?
Right, the corporate level training, policy.
Okay.
But it will capture if you take a course like this, right? You could then log that you took this to have credit for that. You have ASQ certifications or something, you could capture that. So what kind of questions come up there?
So used as evidence for the competency of the resources.
That's what I was looking for. Everybody hear the word competency, right? Because what's the actual requirement for the standards? Is it training? No. This is a common mistake I've written on this in some of my videos and in the post. Everybody has a training management system, right? And every EQMS you buy has a training management module. Where's the requirement for training in the standard? It doesn't have one. The requirement is competency. And so that's what you need to think about in this situation. Is this a competency management system that they're establishing, which therefore would be needed to meet requirements of the standard? So that was the hidden trick on that one. So, but that's what I wanted to hear is if anybody picked up on the word competency, because things like external training and certifications would be part of competency. And you could argue maybe those corporate policies create competency as well. All right. Let's see. What would be another good one to look at here? I hope somebody got it. Well, we got the groups in the room. So who was room 11 here? All right. So you guys had the MES. What'd you guys come up with? I'm going to speak to spokesperson.
We broke it down by the different intended uses.
Okay.
So there's bulleted lists. And so there's a couple of them that we pointed to as more high risk. They're higher likelihood of being higher risk based off of the functions. So like electronic batch records, batch release, and labeling controls. And then with the other ones, they could potentially be high risk, but we would need to know more about what the mitigations are in place, what it's actually being used for, just understand more of that intended use. And then use that to scale our validation approach. So for those high process risk ones, having the scripted testing for it, and then depending on how the evidence shakes out, doing whatever scalable approach makes sense for those features.
And that's what I was looking for in that one, right? To go, yeah, there may be some differences between the different things in the bulleted list there. And again, no right or wrong answer. One of them was thrown in there as one that was hopefully obvious, the process metrics. Seems more like a business issue, right?
We weren't sure though what process metrics.
And that would be the question you'd have to ask. What do you mean by process?
Yes.
Metrics, right? So yeah, so good. That's why I threw that one in there to see if I could create some discussion. Okay, good. I think you got some of the aspects there. All right, either room 6 or room 12 had the feedback and complaints analysis that's AI based. Who wants to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, I can speak on room 6, and we had about 5-6 members in our group. and other guys also feel free to chime in. But I was able to document some information which is still there with me when we were doing that assessment. So I'll share that. We had this feedback and complaint analysis AI-based software with the intended use of reviewing the complaint records. And for the questions, does the software require validation? We answered as yes. And for the risk level, we believe that this is a medium risk, or we can say not high risk. It's a QMS application with no direct impact to patient safety. And for understanding the type of validation that is required, we used some of the considerations, like this is a supporting software, not a direct production software, and it's an AI-based software, so human in the loop is required. It's automated, but because it's a feedback and complaint analysis software, it's not a complaint handling software. It's not directly required by the regulations. So in terms of the overall validation strategy, we thought it would be a lean intended use validation with the human in the loop. And from the deliverables point of view, the validation or assurance deliverables, we didn't think that we need to go to the level of detailed design specification, etc. Functional software requirements with a combination of one validation plan and report, single document. And when it comes to testing, we were thinking a component risk-based level testing, which is a mix of both unscripted and limited scripted testing, would be sufficient. And production monitoring should be in place with the human in the loop.
Okay. I think Team 12 may have some differing opinions, so I'm anxious to hear. Because I saw some body language as we talk. So this is great that two teams worked on the same one. So let's see, 12, what are your thoughts on
I think it's dependent on a couple of assumptions. First, the source, whether it's off the shelf, how much is customized, trained based on the company's information. So that's one dependency. And the second one, I think they've touched upon the human dependence. How much of human dependency is involved in the decision making? If the AI is used to extract information, classify the complaint code, determine if it's reportable or not, then a final user, a human, confirms that decision, it could potentially fall from a high to medium. Or if the human even has visibility to the raw data, so the direct call, the email that comes through, still verifies everything, it could be even a low. But if everything's automated, definitely has to be high because it's used for classifying complaints as reportable. Then potentially for training, depending on how level of training, we trigger to take some actions as well. Investigation, classification, so those are all, to me, it's high risk, or to us, it's high risk.
But also the fact that it's receiving feedback and complaints immediately makes it direct impact, because we're talking about pharmaceuticals or devices. Complaints are a key component to patient safety, so it has to be high risk because it's a direct impact.
Marie, I see you have your hand.
Depends on the.
Would you go ahead and ask your question or make your point?
Yeah, I'm currently working with some AI developers who are trying to create AIs for exactly for this. For one is for the kappa process, and one is for complaints, and it's more of a complaint handling where it's actually going to be they're actually going to be doing analysis on the kappa's analysis on the complaints to kind of determine what are the next steps, what has to be done. Wouldn't that require a little higher validation because of the fact that it is kind of helping make decisions on how the product's going to be handled, whether changes need to be made, whether things need to be upgraded?
Yeah, I agree. I was going to push back a little bit on Room 6's interpretation. I do believe there's potential for impact to the patients because of the idea that this AI is going to be looking at things like trending and whether or
Yeah.
not we need to report, right? Which can get to the public health issues. And if I'm looking for trends, and I read a lot of warning letters. Again, if you follow me every Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, I do a post called Inadequate Response where I break down a warning letter of what went wrong there. And this is a very common thing of companies collecting and managing their complaints, but not trending correctly. Because that should drive, wait, look what keeps coming up. That might indicate an overall deficiency in the device that we need to do something with. In some cases, there was one, I think a month or two ago, where the complaints clearly indicated patient harm had occurred, and they closed them out with no action whatsoever, as not a problem, right?
But sorry, I have to interfere here a bit because at least based on the explanation here, it stated that the AI is reviewing it review the data of an existing database, I assume, which is supported usually by human in the loop. So the decisions and everything is not AI based. It's just a supporting tool for reviewing if, let's say, the complaint file is according to the defined procedure, matching based on evaluation, trending, whatever kind of information is defined. So if you look at that point, in my opinion, our group, meaning group 6, was very well done based on having that not as a not assessed
and I was
as a
going to
high
note, you
risk.
guys mentioned the human in the loop, which I think is an appropriate control here, right? And we talked about how you can, FDA said, applying controls can help reduce the risk profile. And so this is a common problem with AI ML tools right now, is this failure to include a human in the loop, because it's so easy and quick and it just seems right. And we become over reliant on it and just assume it's telling us the truth, right? And even if you add a human in the loop, the challenge becomes the AI just processed a whole bunch of information. Can a human really check that, right? So those are the concerns that come up. And I'll get into that when I talk about AI.
We did.
But these are the challenges, and that's why I put this one in there, because I knew it would create some interesting.
But come on, we did that before the AI area very well as well. So everybody had this scenario, and AI is now currently only a supporting tool for me. So never trust AI without human interaction here. Sorry.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately,
I just know in the past it wasn't done particularly well by humans.
And unfortunately, the AIs that they're building are supposed to, they're learning. The more they're learning, I feel like the more the humans are going to kind of back off and say, oh, well, the AI is handling it.
The more it appears to be right, the confidence level goes up.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, let's hold these thoughts because we're going to talk about AI in a second. And I do want to move on. I know does anybody have anything particularly, important that they thought they discovered as part of the exercise? Because we don't have time to go through every group, like I said. But if one team has something in particular they really wanted to get out for discussion, go ahead.
I would like to add that these examples that we have seen, there is also a lot of subjectiveness in this, in the sense that what classification of the drug or medical device we are talking about, and how much is the risk to the patient from that failure of that system to be considered, and the intended use, I would say, is also limited. Like if I take the example of room number 6 software and 12 software, it's essentially a feedback and complaint analysis software, which is an analytical tool to me. Now, how much of that is going to be relied upon for making a patient-related decision is not clear. So I would say we should be open to all of these assessment. And eventually, the idea of the CSA is to have a risk-based approach here.
So you're saying I didn't give you an appropriate amount of intended use information?
I think based on what was there, the 4 lines, all the teams, both the rooms have done their work and saw 2 perspectives, which is good enough to know, there can be 2 sides of it, right?
Yeah, I wonder if that was intentional on my part. So. get to the idea, right, of why getting that intended use very detailed can completely change the discussion, because otherwise assumptions kick in, right? Groupthink, right? And all of a sudden you make decisions because it sounds right, but that wasn't really where you're supposed to go. All right, that's a good observation. All right, great. All right, I am sharing the screen. Somebody put in the chat that the screen wasn't being shared. It should be visible again. But thanks for pointing that out. All right. Again, right, there's no black and white on this. The exercise was intended to make you have these debates and understand this is what needs to occur, right? Sometimes it'll be straightforward. Microsoft Word, we're done. We got it. Nothing special there, right? Others require some light conversation. Others require a lot of conversation, right? To make sure, do we really understand what we're trying to do with this software? And then what does that drive in terms of validation? All right, let's keep it moving here. So let's talk about some real world situations. We got a little over a half hour left. I think I allocated 45 minutes, but we'll try to get through this. All right, so commercial off the shelf software. Who's heard this one? I know every software vendor loves to tell you, don't worry about validation. We understand you need to validate this. We provide you with a validation pack, right? Or it's pre-validated. Okay, here's the problem. That's simply not possible. Okay, not in its entirety, because they don't know what you're going to do with it. Okay. Now again, it's Microsoft Word, not a problem. Of course, they're not going to tell you it's validated either. But again, if it's something very specific, very simple, there's only one thing to do with it, then you might be able to get away with them telling you we've already validated it. But I see this on EQMS systems, ERP systems, and I go, it's misleading at best. Okay. Even if they provide a validation pack, say this will help you do the validation. If you're familiar with IQ, OQ, PQ, they can tell you IQ, right? Because that's easy. Did you install it according to how they tell you to install it? The OQ, when I want it to do a change request, can it generate a change request? Yes, that's OQ. Does the functions I want it to do. PQ is, does it do it the way I need to do it? They can't possibly tell you that in advance because they don't know. Okay. Now I have seen at least one vendor did actually have a pretty good PQ template to drive the questions you should be asking yourself. I thought that was a good approach. So they didn't try to say, oh, we've got this covered. They just said, we can help you understand what you should be thinking about, which I thought was okay. But again, that PQ is your intended use. That's where the rubber hits the road. What am I going to do with that piece of software? Again, if you're using very general, when we've talked about the Word, Excel, those kind of things, those kind of commercial off the shelf, FDA in its examples and the guidance has made it clear, they don't expect you to validate those. They're just tools. I mean, right? Technically, we talked about CAD tools earlier. There's no difference between a CAD tool and a drawing board. Their intended use is the same. Produce an engineering drawing. Right now, it is you're producing CAD models, but still, it's just a writing tool, an idea generation tool, right? So FDA is going, yeah, we don't really care about that. Now, take that CAD model and put it into an FEA analysis tool, where you're going to decide, is it actually reliable? Will it stand up to the stresses and whatever it's supposed to, do, and how will it perform? Now, that's a little different, right? And you'd want to know, how do I know my FEA tool works with the models and the approaches I'm going to use to do all that analysis? Yeah.
Sorry, question on that. Is there like a good definition for like, what fits into that bucket of like the general business uses? Or, trying to standardize, I guess, like how do we...
So it comes back to, is it in production? Does it manage production or does it manage the QMS? Everything outside of that bubble, nope, is excluded, right? These are just basic examples, and the guidance does sort of the same thing, but they just keep coming back. Remember, what's in scope is managing production or managing the QMS. Right? Otherwise, you're free and clear, essentially. Now, the challenge of COTS and I'll talk about that soup in a second, is you usually don't have a whole lot of control. Okay? If somebody told you you were going to have to validate Word, how much cooperation do you think you're going to get from Microsoft? Okay? Not a whole lot. And the same thing happens with other software vendors. Hey, hi, we want to buy your software. By the way, would you give us insights into how you do everything? And can we see your test reports and your protocols? And they're going to go, yeah, no, we're not sharing that information. So what FDA expects you to do is get what you can. You have brochures, spec sheets, sales sheets. You have the user guide, the installation guide, or they do provide you with enough documentation, right? And FDA says, yeah, you should be gathering all that and looking through that relative to your intended use and going, does any of that give you a hint to the foreseeable failures and any risks related to what you're trying to do with it? I have as the last sub-bullet there, inquire about how they do their internal QA. Companies that are selling software into a regulated space, I see more and more are getting used to this question and maybe have a white paper to give you, right? They're not going to tell you all their deep secrets about how they do their testing and what tools they use and what their failure rates are, but they will tell you the general framework they're using, right? To help you say, all right, we have one, that's a good sign, right? That they were willing to share that and could actually describe their QA environment, which makes me feel more confident that this isn't as risky a piece of software as it might for what we're trying to do with it. And now the challenge becomes, if you're going with software of unknown provenance, who do you ask? Right? It's not owned by anybody. It's out on some website somewhere, some repository. Maybe there's somebody who sort of administrates that, but they won't claim ownership of the software, right? And if it's one of these things where people can go in and add code as they want, modify code as they want, and it's sort of a group effort to create this stuff, that becomes problematic, right? Because it's going to be really hard for you to establish that there's any degree of control that you can rely on here. Back to the 62304 question, and again, I will do a more detailed answer on this, but if I remember correctly, again, with 62304, it still comes down to not the fact that it is soup, but do you understand how it plays a role in foreseeable failure with your intended use? Right? The same way, one particular way you use some sort of software can be low risk, but another use of the same exact software can be considered high risk. So it's what are you going to do with this? The example I give, I worked for a company that was doing software as a medical device with imaging software. And we found out that the entire graphics library was soup. Okay? This isn't like, oh, we found some graphics routines that helps us with the user interface, makes it look nice. This is an imaging analysis software, and all of the graphics algorithms are completely out of our control. That's not good. Okay? That's a problem. That is a high risk soup. Okay? So what do we do with that? What do you do if that's how things are? God, we could save a lot of time by downloading that library. We don't have to do volume calculations on our own. They've already figured all that out. Well, what we ended up doing is we told the engineering team, you need to grab the latest version of the source code that you're using. And now we own it. Never to go back to that website. Now we consider it our source code and we will manage it. We will do an analysis and figure out where are the risky areas. And now we'll design testing around that, right, to prove that it actually works. And so the same thing could apply, right, to non-product software. You just got to understand, what are we using that for? How dangerous is that soup within the context of how we're going to use it? Could be you go, it's a pretty innocuous thing that we're using it for. Okay, great. Document that, state that's what we use it for. As long as we use it within that intended use, it doesn't require any validation. But anything beyond that, then you'd have to establish, then let's say the source code isn't available. The only thing you can download is the executable, right? Then you need to figure out, right, it's a black box to us. How are we going to test what we can from outside that black box relative to how we want to use it? All right. Yeah.
What about using like DocuSign for like your change management control forms, your annual review forms, those types of things?
I mean, is it okay?
Well, like, do you have to go through and do a validation, like, because it is part of the QMS, but it's, I guess I don't know how to navigate that.
Yeah, so again, the nice thing is the DocuSigns and the Adobe Signs of the world understand they're going to be using these environments. And so they do typically have the information you need. Right. So it's inquire.
Okay.
You go, hey, how you know, you guys have dealt with this, how would we explain this to a regulatory body?
But because it's part of the QMS, you need to have like a validated.
You need to account for the fact we are using this for electronic signatures, right? So under Part 11, we need to have certain, right, artifacts in place to show that we understand the nature of this. But we've, from the vendor, from DocuSign, we've gotten a white paper on how they ensure cybersecurity and identification and confirmation, right? Encryption, right? You go, oh, these are all the things that are important, right? So you can build that, right? And then go, yeah. So then it appears to be able to do what we need it to do reliably. And that meets the requirements of Part 11 and anywhere else where, right? There's always been this argument, things like, is email valid from a regulatory perspective? Right? Because, oh, somebody sent me their authorization by email. Can I use that? I'm not going to get into the debate here. My view is absolutely I can. It's time stamped, and assuming that only one person could sign in and it gave me their name and they had to sign in for corporate security, right? Then why would that not be valid from a Part 11 perspective? Right? But there are other people who go, absolutely not, the email is unreliable. It's like, show me Part 11 where it doesn't comply. You had a question?
For COTS, what do you do in scenarios where you're asked to audit a supplier?
Yeah, good luck. They're usually not crazy about having you come in, right? It's an age-old problem. Right, I see this a lot because we deal with so many small companies, right? And they need to do supplier management. That's where it falls under. And they go, well, this potentially becomes a critical supplier for us, and our procedure says we have to audit critical suppliers every 2 years. And okay, we're XYZ Corporation with 20 employees and 5 million in revenue, and we're buying components or services or software from Gigantum Corporation, right, who is $30 billion. They don't even hear us when we ask the question. The expectation would be, again, what can you get a hold of? What's available on their website? Is there somewhere you can say, do you guys have some sort of explanation of your QA process? Again, if they are involved with clients in a regulated space, they typically will have that. You do run into the situation where you go, they don't have any clients. I was working at a company where we were buying foam, structural foam for a product. And we were buying it. Luckily, there was a company literally 2 miles down the road that could provide what we needed. Except 99% of their clients were in the construction business. And when they built foam, they literally built stuff that could fill this room for going under roads, things like that. And here we walk and go, oh, we want to buy foam that's, a 1/2 inch thick, and our tolerances are like 1/10 of an inch. And they literally started laughing. And they said, our tolerances are more like 1/2 inch to 1 inch, plus or minus. We can't hold to 1/10 of an inch. Right? What do we do? Well, we had to justify and go, it's structural foam. It had nothing to do with the performance of the device. It was like filler. And so then we were like, do we care? I know we set it to be 1/10 of an inch. Did we just guess at that? Was there a real reason for setting to 1/10 of an inch? Or if it was 2/10 of an inch off, would we still be able to use it? Right. So you need to figure out again, what are we trying to do? And what does that mean for our selection of suppliers? Now, the answer is, oh no, it absolutely has to hold to those tolerances, those characteristics. Then maybe you need to hunt around and find somebody who will answer some questions. Right. That could be the the challenge there.
Steve,
Yeah.
Peter had a question / comment.
Okay. There. Go up a little bit. All right. Okay. I notice the list of CAD as a generic infrastructure type software. Our firm uses DICOM to CAD to directly generate patient-specific physical modeling. Am I correct that we have correctly identified these CAD software as requiring a validation because it is both production-specific and patient-specific? Yes, your intended use would indicate a higher risk than just the standard translation of data from one format to another. That patient-specific piece, I think, is very important here, right? Because again, we're looking at foreseeable failures leading to patient harm. And you're saying this is essentially a patient-specific custom, use of the data. So yeah, I think you're right in going, yep, that looks to be higher risk or high risk in this situation. Because it's pretty direct, the pathway back to the patient. All right, good. Oops, yeah, on the right screen. All right. Again, the guidance recognizes that software comes in a variety of forms. There isn't much we do these days where anybody actually directly installs software on local servers. Most of what we buy these days is cloud-based. The other ones, that's essentially what software as a service is, right? Platform as a service is sort of an expansion of that. Kind of like, oh, we can create an environment for you, right, with multiple tools that are already integrated. The infrastructure as a service is relatively new, but you can literally not even have your own network. You log into somebody else's network, and that's the operating environment you're in. Okay. That one may be different than excluding networks, right? Your own network is under your control, and you could say that's just general infrastructure stuff, right? Not directly related to or not specifically focused on production or QMS. But if you go, oh, we don't even have our own network, we go into this other total cloud environment for everything, then you might have to take a different look at it. Go, oh, do we really understand how that's working? What if it's down? What if they go out of business? Well, this isn't like one piece of software where you need to figure out how we're using it. This is like our entire operating environment, right? So I'd look more closely at something like that. But some of the questions that came up earlier, people were posting about this, right? So when you're relying on this cloud-based stuff, right, what do you do about updates? Okay, so you'd want to understand that, right? Do you get advance notice of that? Do you get a choice? Right? I talk about Microsoft updates. Usually I get told that there's an update available. Most of the time I get to choose, but sometimes I wake up and I get told that it was done because it was a security update or something like that, right? And they were like, we're not giving you a choice. So how do you manage that, right? And do they tell you exactly what changed? Now, I think it's usually pretty typical to have that accessible to you. But how are you going to process that? Okay, great. So they give you release notes. Okay, but they've already changed the software on you, right? And you wake up and business has started for the day. And now this new version of the software is running and people are on it. And I have to read through these release notes, understand their impact. Do I tell everybody, hey, everybody, sit back, off your keyboards? We need a couple hours to go check this out, right? It can be tough to run your business that way. So again, you're going to need to understand what's the role that this plays, our intended use. And so, you might want to play some scenarios. Suppose they updated something and the change negates or removes a configuration setting that we were relying on. And now we can't actually follow our own procedure because that option is simply not there anymore. Okay. So it's just, I don't have an answer how you do this. It's what you have to be thinking about. What do I need to ask? To the point of understanding the requirements and the capabilities before I make the purchase or make a decision on who I'm going to purchase from. You need to understand if this is what I'm doing with it, what are all these foreseeable problems that I need to make sure I understand before I say that's acceptable or it's not acceptable. Okay, so it's not an easy thing to look at. And if it turns out it's high risk, right, and there are no good control options, there's always, everybody forgets this part where you go, then I guess we can't use that. And I get it. People who recommended the software get really enamored, right, with that. I want that piece of software from XYZ, and you're going, can't do it. Right? They won't give us the information we need. It has a high chance of creating foreseeable failures, right? That would be bad if they were to occur, even though the probabilities seem low, that kind of thing, although that's not supposed to be a consideration. There's always got to be that, hey, we can't use that. This should be part of standard supplier controls, right? This isn't something specific to buying software. But I do see this missing in a lot of supplier control stuff, that it's just about, somebody tells us what they want to buy and who they want to buy it from, and we just make sure we're comfortable with that. That's not really the way supplier control is supposed to work, right? Whether it's software or components or raw materials or services, there's supposed to be more to the decision making. And that applies to software that you're purchasing as well. That's the challenge there. So this could be like its own 2-day workshop. So I apologize, we're not going to go very deep on this, right? But we know this is the new Wild West out there. We really don't know what we're doing here, right? Everybody saw the story last week about the AI that went out and broke into another company's environment. Basically, the AI chose to commit a felony, despite the controls that were in place to not let it do that. It first figured its way out, and then it went and attacked another company. That was a scary one. Took them a second to get it back under control and stop it. Luckily, the company attacked actually was able to defend itself. Its AI was able to fend off the attack. So, but that was very eye-opening, right? So we are so nascent in what we're doing here. This is, the guidance has nothing very specific about this other than recognizing, yep, it's in scope. Something to consider. AI tools, are like any other software tool. Again, it's going to come down, what are you using it for? How are you using it? So we raised some questions earlier about the human in the loop. Is that a sufficient control? Hard to say, right? And that risk of becoming confident because initial results look good. And that's what happened in this situation, is they felt like they could put up the right guardrails because it had worked before. Forgetting that the whole point of AI is that it learns, and it figured out where the weaknesses were and found a way out of its controlled environment and into the general network. So there's nothing specific for non-product software. Again, if it's deemed high risk, then I'd look to the guidance and the emerging regulations coming out. There will be standards coming out in the next year and a half related to risk management of AI ML. It's not going to be very different than your product software. You decide that this is something that's a high risk non-product software, I'd say the rules would be pretty similar to any other AI software that you're implementing for the product. And as I said there, in other words, it's not going to be easy. And like I said, we could spend easily another day, 2 days, discussing the problems of AI and ML. Somebody raised the point before about the example I gave of an AI tool that's looking at your complaints and your feedback, and then looking at trending, which is okay, I added in things like, what was it, looking at consistency, and somebody said it in passing, and I don't know if they intended the meaning for this, but they talked about what is it trained on? I don't think they use those exact words. Is it trained on general knowledge? Or is it trained on just what's available inside the company? And I know a lot of companies that are developing their own AI tools are doing that, right? They don't want the stuff going out to a large language model like ChatGPT, where it then becomes part of the general knowledge base. So they are constraining it to their own file systems. Well, what if that's all crap? What if they've not been doing a good job up until now? Right? And now it's trying to learn from the trends and looks at what you're doing today and goes, oh yeah, that's perfectly consistent with what you've always been doing. That wasn't really the answer we were looking for, right? That's the danger. And that's the whole problem with AI is your training database is so critical to this. How do you know whether your training base is any good? Other than asking an AI to look at it and tell you whether it's good. What is it going to, it's sort of this infinity mirror. It just keeps going down this rabbit hole. So I don't have any good advice here. Just that whoever is doing this better be cognizant of the very quickly changing environment out there in terms of guidance documents. Like I said, there should be some standards coming, but they're going to move really quickly. The day they come out, they're going to be wrong, right? This is the fastest moving technology I think we've ever seen, and it's going to be really hard to keep up on it. And we're going to get things wrong because we're going to think we have control, as like what happened last week, and then realize that was, a facade. We don't actually have control of that, and therefore the rules we put in place are not going to be effective. How are we going to make that work? And some of it becomes voluntary. Some of the discussion I saw on news programs about this incident last week was they were saying we need legislation to require the makers of these types of software to put these safeguards in. Okay, and if they don't, by the time you figure out that they didn't, it may be too late, right? So this is the danger here. Homegrown software. Okay. Doesn't really matter that you're making it yourself. Okay. Again, what are you using it for? So the fact that you developed it internally doesn't necessarily make it more risky than purchasing it, unless you understand the context of what you're doing with it. Okay. What was the example somebody may have given earlier? If you were trying to develop your own statistical analysis tool, and you're going to use that to optimize the algorithms in your image analysis software. All right, I might question that one. Now, if you're employing some of the best PhDs in that area, then maybe you're better than whoever could sell you that software. But that might be the consideration. Are we actually capable of building a tool as good as what we could buy? If you happen to have the person who wrote the book working for you, then maybe you could say, yeah, we've got this nailed down. Okay? I worked in a company like that, where our chief engineer was basically the one everybody in the industry looked to for this technology. So we were pretty confident we had it down, because he was literally writing the white papers and helping to write the standards, and everybody was looking at him to say, how do we do this? So yeah, that was a good position to be in. But if he hadn't been working for us, been working for somebody else, then it'd be, can we trust that our chief engineer is actually as good as the one who's driving everything from there? Right. So again, sounding like a broken recording here. Intended use, and then from there, you'll be able to figure out what's the risk level going to look like, which will then tell you what do you got to do about all of this. I would say for sure, you'd want to see a well-defined internal software development process. This shouldn't be an ad hoc exercise. Oh, I know how to write code. I'll take care of this. Right? Here you go. A day later, ChatGPT or Gemini or something helped me write that code. Right? Wait. like, because it's internally developed doesn't mean it doesn't have the same type of pitfalls. All right, let's talk about spreadsheets here. So as I talked about before, right, your basic, oh, I'm going to use this to log some information or do some basic calculations just to help me speed some stuff up. Probably not within scope. But the more complex the formulas are, and you can create some really, I mean, if you're not a big Excel user, I am, I've created some amazingly complex formulas. I write Visual Basic for macros and for automation code, but that's because I have a background in software development, right? So I feel pretty confident in my ability to do that. But understand, you're writing code. A formula is really no different than programming languages. So it's no different than homegrown software. And I think that gets lost on a lot of companies. It's just, oh, it's Excel. It's not software. We're not developing software. Yeah, you are. Okay. Oh, we're not using any VBA. But I look at some of their formulas and I go, that was really complex. How'd you know that works? Have you tested it? Have you pushed the boundaries of it? Do you know it works in all situations of your intended use? Can you tell me what your intended use is when you designed that formula? The questions are exactly the same for any other piece of software. Just think of Excel as another programming environment. That's the way to get people educated within your environment. Because wherever you go, people are going to fight you on validating spreadsheets until you can show them the criteria. So I went through this at one of the companies I was at, and they were just like, you mean I have to go validate every damn spreadsheet I ever create? No. Here, I'm going to give you the criteria. Right? And I gave them a decision tree and I said, are you using it only for this? You're done. You're good. Okay. But I wanted to know in the inventory that they had that. So I said, all you need to do is to let me know you have a spreadsheet and this is what you're doing with it. I have a record of it and I can make a decision and document that decision. And you're free and clear to go. And you're like, oh, I can do that. That's not burdensome, right? But if I said, oh, wait, you want to bring this out to the production area and you're going to use it to make recommendations to the operator on how to change the settings on the machine, that's a different situation. You're actually controlling the production process by doing that. Okay, so we need to look at that differently. And like any other piece of software, there should be some sort of procedure that tells them how to develop these more complex spreadsheets. Coding practices. They won't want to hear that, right? Because a lot of times they're not software developers. What do you mean by coding practices? Right? Have they considered human factors if they're not the only one using it? Right? Things like embedded help, visual characteristics. Can you look at it and tell where do I enter data and where can I not enter data? Which gets you to protection of those cells, right? Can you avoid people, and I apologize, looks like we're going over. But online, if you need to jump out here, if you need to leave, I get it. So we were doing really good on the timing and then somewhere we lost about 10, maybe 15 minutes. How do you protect that code in the background so that people can't go in and alter it either intentionally or unintentionally? I talked about using the data validation capabilities, right? You can set that in Excel so that a cell has to have certain characteristics, otherwise the entry won't be accepted. If you're going to share that spreadsheet, how are you going to manage access to it? Because I see it all the time where there's a spreadsheet available to production and it's just up and available. Somebody in the morning logs in, puts the spreadsheet up, and now 6 different people walk over during the day and enter information. I have no idea who did what, when they did it, how, there's no audit trail possible because it's just one login. Right? And then how do you want to test this? It's a piece of software. If you determine that if it's within the realm of needing to be validated, whether it's high risk or non-high risk, what type of testing is going to be required? It's no different than any other piece of software. Yeah.
I would just also add, like for spreadsheets, this doesn't happen very often at companies, but there are some companies, including one I used to work at, where different types of teams would actually have different operating systems. So if I was, working in software development, I actually had a Mac versus a Windows PC. And Excel spreadsheets, there's like an issue sometimes between operating systems where the spreadsheet will actually give you a different calculated value if you're on one operating system versus the other. So you actually can't just trust the math to math in the very basic formulas.
Yeah, right.
So it's
Yeah. Like any other piece of software, the platform you run it on.
yeah, just
right,
because you can
make a
open
big
it on a
difference, yeah.
different,
Yeah,
on a different.
the other one I've seen is where everybody's got Excel on their desktop, but the company used Google Docs, Google Workspace as a storage repository where it converts it to Google Sheets. And then you can download it back out. You're constantly converting. And that same kind of problem occurs.
So GAMP has actually a nice appendix, special appendix dealing with spreadsheets. And identifies 4 categories and how to control those categories.
There you go. That's a good
Nice
use.
resource.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for sharing that. So again, usually somebody creating a spreadsheet for themselves, probably not going to require validation. But again, I'd still want to be aware of it, be able to ask some certain questions, tell me what you're doing exactly with this, right? And how does it fit into your work? But again, if they're using it and it turns out, well, what you're creating is one of the required records, then we may need to know more about that. When you say, oh, now we're creating it, we're going to share this throughout the company for multiple people to use. It's essentially the same as commercializing a piece of software. Okay? You ever want to get frustrated, take your favorite spreadsheet, go, oh, I want to share this with people. Okay, give up the rest of your job because now you're in the software support business. Everybody's going to be calling you constantly on, hey, I was using that spreadsheet, it's great, except when I do this, I hit this error, or could you make this work like this, right? Just understand, it's no different than commercializing business. It's not to be undertaken lightly. So I talked about earlier, one of the requirements of certain risk level spreadsheet, maybe one of the requirements is if they're writing VBA code, that somebody do a VBA code review, right? And this is where you set up what are my coding standards, right, or best practices. And then, great, give me your code, and somebody who understands coding can then do an assessment like this, right? This isn't meant to be all encompassing. Again, I did this for a small client, so at least it has something to go. What are the basic requirements, that we expect to see in how they code, to make sure that it is stable, reliable, robust code that we can continue to use. Okay, a couple more minutes and then I can get out of here. All right, so I said, don't worry too much about what the inspectors, but let's talk about the inspectors, okay? And because a lot of times we assume, right, when that question comes up, wait, what'll happen in an audit, right? And then fear creeps in, and we think of the worst case scenarios and our assumptions about what auditors and inspectors want. And what I find more often than not is most people actually don't understand what an audit or inspection is actually intended to do. In this regard, they want to know, can you tell me exactly what you're doing with this software? Where did you document this? Right? Not just you do it off the top of your head, because if it isn't documented, it didn't happen, right? All right, so, and then you said you did this type of testing, where's your rationale for that? Can you explain that? If you chose not to do a certain type of testing or certain test, why? Defending this. And can you show me that the software actually is doing what you want it to do? Where's the results? That's very typical what auditors do. They don't tell you how to run your business. They want to know, how do you think? And then convince me that that's correct within the confines of the regulations and standards. It's not a witch hunt. I know audits often feel that way. Okay, sometimes that's just bad auditors, and you do run into bad auditors. But generally, so I'm a certified auditor. The first thing they teach us is we're not there to uncover non-conformance. We are there to confirm conformance. Positive looking things. What we want to see is that you understood and did the right things. In doing so, we may find some things you didn't do right. Bad auditors go in and go, what can I do? Where did they get the dot and not? Okay. All right, and a last look at this. Again, visuals are always usually better. Like, this is the environment that they're talking about in the, I didn't realize that control panel's been hanging down in front of everything here. If I can move that out of the way. There we go. Sorry about that. So just a nice visual, kind of give you the idea of how this all fits together. Right? So it's easier to remember here, but what is the software? Okay, what are we going to do with it? How could that go wrong? How does that impact the process? How does that impact the device? How does that impact the patient? Now, what are we going to do? That's pretty much what the regulation or the guidance is telling. Okay. All right, what kind of last questions that we got? See if anything's in there.
What about, like if you're transitioning away from a software platform that you use for records, how does that look for record retention? And making sure that you can still access those records 5, 10, 7 years, whatever it is down the road.
So this is part of why I say, right, this all should integrate with some IT management procedure, process, policy.
Yep.
Because that should not only be about how do I put in software, but what do I do when I'm getting out? Right? When I go to retire, the end of life, you can't just turn it off because you've got data there, right? What's your path forward with that data? Can you archive it? 10 years from now, can we access it? Right? I run into this in audits all the time when I look at companies' record retention procedures or policies, their backup procedures, and they love to say, oh, it's all done electronically, so now we keep it forever. Okay. So you've got a CAD file from 15 years ago that was created on a version of the software that was 3.0, and 15 years later, and now it's version 20. You sure it still can open that file? And that it will look the same, to your point, switching operating systems, the hardware has changed, the drivers have changed. Okay? Back then it was loaded software on the engineer's desktop. Now it's in the cloud. Did that change how it operates? Anybody have any PowerPoints from prior to 1997? You don't, maybe involved. You count on the fact that you can always open a PowerPoint file. Not if it's pre-1997. PowerPoint will not open a pre-1997 PowerPoint file. The only way to open it is you need to find an old version of PowerPoint 1997 or 1996, open the file, and resave it. And then it'll work going forward. That doesn't guarantee they won't make a change again. So yeah, so valid point. Right? We used to have that, oh, we've got everything on tape, or we've got it on floppy disks, or whatever, right? And none of that is forever. Right? So yeah, you got to be careful of that. How would you know?
Yeah.
Right? And you don't really have the resource to go, well, every year we open it, resave it. Who's got the time and the resources? And again, how do you know in that time frame software didn't change such that the outputs are now different? So that's always problematic. But it should be something where your IT procedure says, if we're going to retire a system, we need to sit down and ask a bunch of questions.
Is that something that you can work into like a supplier agreement whenever you're purchasing software, that they guarantee if they ever exit the business that they provide those records to you?
That's actually very common. There is, what do they call it? It's like a mortgage term. And you should check with this when you have critical systems. What is the term? But they're basically always supposed to create a repository where the source code is kept. So that if they go out of business, you have access to it and versions of the software. Can't remember the term. Probably as I'm driving home. But yeah, they're supposed to create this repository that you can always go back to whether the company exists or not. It's parked somewhere independently, so that customers will always have access to it. but it's a good question to ask.
Yeah.
What happens when you go out of business?
Gotta know
Are
that.
you creating this backup that we still have access to?
Hi, I have a question about
Yeah.
retrospective validation. Hi, my name is Vijay Villavan. I have a question about retrospective validation. In addition to what we discussed today, would it be even more abbreviated, when we do retrospective validation? And how about leveraging operational records? Because, it's been used for a while. So what would be the strategy for retrospective validation?
So for those who might not be familiar with the concept, retrospective validation is where you've been using something for a while that you didn't validate, but you realize you've been collecting data. And so instead of starting a brand new validation from this is point zero, you go, oh, we could go look back at all that old data and demonstrate that the system has actually been operating correctly. So that is allowable. The key is that data valid? Go back to controls. How was it generated? How is it stored? How will you analyze, or how has it been analyzed? Right? Has it been manipulated over time? Did you make changes that? So you can do that. You could certainly do that with a piece of software, right? We've been using this software for 5 years. And so we have some metrics on the use of that. Sure, you could go look back, right? If you felt like that was done in a controlled environment and that data is sound, right? Couldn't have been manipulated, right? The integrity is good. Then you could go, that's a shortcut to getting validated. We don't need to start over.
Okay, so the key is that data needs to be sound, but from a process point of view, from validating the system point of view, we would have to run through the same steps, right? If you follow CSA.
You'd want to do the initial assessment, right? Understand the risks and go, is a retrospective valid in this case? Or the risks high enough that, yeah, I know we've been using it for a while, but really we should start from scratch.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Yep.
I do have one more. I don't know whether if it's within the confines of validation per se, but data migration. So we did look at, when we say validation, we talked about validating for intended use, but when it comes to migration, yes, it comes, we're now specifically focusing on just the migrated data. So how would CSA apply to?
Sorry, I didn't realize that was me. I'm sorry, my phone rang and I had to turn it off. So, can you go back up 10 seconds?
Yeah, I was saying that how does CSA apply to data migration?
The data migration?
Yes.
Again, right? I assume you're migrating because you're moving to a new application, new piece of software, right? So part of the consideration of validating that new software is how we're going to populate it with previous data. So kind of to the question that was asked earlier, we're going to retire one system and move into a new system. If the data has to go, then yes, you need to understand as part of the risk assessment that that's a risk. How do we know that data will translate correctly?
Okay.
Right? If it's from one doc control system to another, and we're just moving a bunch of Word files and PDFs, probably pretty straightforward. PDFs are one of those things that has been really consistent ever since version 1. They understood the nature of what they were doing, and that caused a problem there. Word, I believe it's all Office applications have that 1997 to some degree. Not quite as bad as PowerPoint, which is absolutely refused to open the file. I think it'll attempt things like Word and Excel files that are older, but it usually gives you a warning that things have changed and you might not be seeing the exact same thing. So at least they understand. But it would be part of how are we going to validate that new system if it needs to use data from an old system. There's all kinds of different ways to approach that. I've been through some of that. Do we need to actually bring everything along? Can we archive it? Like in the case of the doc control system. Well, we've got a bunch of old PDFs. That could be our backup. Let's just dump out all the PDFs into an online folder somewhere, back it up. And if we ever need to go back, we know where they are. But otherwise, 3 years far, we're going to go back.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yep. All right. Any other final thoughts, final questions? Great. All right. Again, If you think of something after, didn't want to ask it here in front of everybody else, that's fine. Okay, get in touch with me by email. Please check out my company. I have to do a little bit of sales. Follow us on LinkedIn. We post every day, everything from funny stuff to serious analysis, various things. I don't know. I like to think we have good stuff to say. So you might learn out. We have a YouTube channel. That's where the video for this will be. We have a website. We have blog articles on there. So take advantage of it. It's all free.
And you said
Otherwise-
we'll get these slides, you said?
Yes,
Okay.
and yeah, when Karen sends out the follow-up in a couple of days, a PDF of the slides will be attached. All of that. Otherwise, thanks. I appreciate sticking with me for an extra 17 minutes, and I appreciate the turnout. It's great because I don't know almost any of you. A lot of times I get my friends in here. Walt is the only one I really know here. So I really appreciate that a bunch of strangers thought to come to see this. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.